Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 7. It's going to be our not Rivals of Ixalan. What is the set called? The Caverns of Ixalan set review for Historic Cube, Unrestricted Cube in our case. I've got the boys on the line with me. They're both here, Teld and Mr. Christopher Sofsky. How's it going, gentlemen?
It's going.
It's good, yeah. Ready to take a deep dive into this set.
Deep dive, call back to the previous podcast. I missed you guys with the conversation with Theo. I don't know if you listened to it or not, but had a good sit down with Theo. Really bummed that we missed the opportunity to post the audio that we had for our Build a Cube series that we recorded a couple weeks back. I think we all walked away from that one thinking that we had a really good episode on our hands, and then technical difficulties meant we couldn't actually get it out to the viewers. But we'll try again with that at some point today. Set review time, which means we don't have a lot of time to mess around. We're talking about the Lost Caverns of Ixalan today. Do you guys have any meaningful relationship with the original Ixalan, Rivals of Ixalan block? Does that set bring back any fond memories for you guys?
Ixalan was the first set that I drafted heavily after picking Magic back up. And I remember distinctly one of my very first drafts as a returning Magic player. I was playing a black-white vampires deck and sort of grinding incremental value, and then my opponent just cast Charging Monstrosaur, and I remember thinking, that card seems kind of stupid.
Well, your mistake was not casting a Colossal Dreadmaw in which to block the Monstrosaur.
Yes, that was in fact my mistake. So I drafted that a lot. It was a really fast format. I know a lot of people didn't like it, but because it was, what's the term that's replacing tribal?
Kindred.
Yeah, because of the Kindred focus of the set, it was like really easy as a new drafter to sort of grok and draft. It didn't provide a lot of powerful cards, but it was the first set that I drafted very heavily after coming back to the game.
For what it's worth, Charging Monstrosaur is still one of the best red cards in our Peasant Cubes.
It really is.
Yes.
So, do you care about Ixalan, the setting, either of the original sets?
Not really, no. I had almost no attachment to it. I was not playing a ton of Magic at the time. I played a lot more directly after that, but at the time I just wasn't really feeling it, didn't really like the set. I did think it was really, really hilarious when they announced it. It was like, all right, so this is going to be the pirate, dinosaur, merfolk, vampire set. And it's like, huh.
Yeah, I always thought it was a little bit of a gimmick as far as like Magic's personal planes go, like their own IPs and stuff like that.
It's okay. This time we've gone full meme and we've added robots to the robot, vampire, dinosaur, pirate, merfolk set.
Yeah. Chris, I think when we met each other playing F&Ms at Get Some Game, I think this was the set that was out, if I remember correctly.
I think so too.
We probably jammed some of these matches against each other at an F&M. I hate the original Ixalan set, and I think Rivals of Ixalan was a small improvement, but not by much. The setting's fine, like dinosaurs, pirates, whatever. Like, it's a little bit on the nose, but it's fine. I don't think anyone really loves it, but this new set looks cool. And we're going to get into that. Before we start talking about our review, just remember that you can find our Discord wherever you are listening to this podcast. And if you don't already know, we are on Spotify now, so you can go and check us out on Spotify. Just search up the Jank Tank. It's worth noting, I mentioned it in our bonus episode with Theo, but we actually got invited to the early access streamer event for Rivals of Ixalan, which is happening on Thursday, I believe. Thursday night, Friday morning. It's the 9th, and then leading into the morning of the 10th. Big shout out to Mop Beeble, one of our admin, who has been pestering Wizards of the Coast to give us access to the early streamer event. You will actually hear from all of us in some capacity, myself, Teld, and Chris, whether we stream, whether we record a couple videos, what have you. We're all going to be participating in that. So super excited for the opportunity to get in on one of these streamer events. Come check it out. Today, on the docket, Lost Caverns of Ixalan for Historic Cube, Arena Cube. That's going to be our focus. We are going to keep this at a pretty high level, talking about our unrestricted cube environment. We may or may not do some peasant content in the near future, but this is going to be high level, looking at the highest power cubes that we have, and basically discussing any cards that we think are super important for the card pool, or cards that we have actually had conversations about, either including or maybe in the future including in our unrestricted cube. The set themes. Tel, you know a little bit more about this than us. Apparently, Lost Caverns of Ixalan was originally designed as like the Journey to the Center of the Earth theme, and I guess that's like an entire genre that I'm just not familiar with. Can you expand on that just a tiny little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly common trope in like sci-fi and to some degree fantasy. There's kind of two parts to it. One is like the underground caverns leads to an entire alien world. So if you're familiar with like Dungeons and Dragons, that's like the Underdark, where there's an entire separate ecosystem that exists below the Earth. And the other one is kind of I always call it the mole people. But it's this idea of like a super advanced underground civilization that is detached from the less advanced upper world. Usually, they self-remove themselves from that. And so that's kind of like the underground gnomes in this one that appear to have like robots and stuff, where I mentioned earlier, we're bringing robots into the mix. So artifacts going to be a big part of this from that technology they're finding, presumably from their descending into the core of Ixalan.
Okay, well, we're just going to use that as a backdrop here for Ixalan. It was designed with that trope in mind, and then Ixalan was kind of added in. But there just a couple things. The original Ixalan was the set that brought us treasure tokens. The dinosaur creature type was introduced there. The pirate creature type was almost introduced there. It was like sneak peeked on a card, I think, a set before. And then Ixalan and Rivals of Ixalan, Chris very slightly alluded to this, but we didn't get a lot of super powerful cards out of that set in the long term. And I think between those two sets, we're only playing like 4 cards, not including some dual lands in our cube right now, and one of those cards is Negate. So we don't have a lot of leftovers from Ixalan, Rivals of Ixalan hanging around. It's just not a super powerful set in the broad scheme of things. This set is much more high power, as we'll get into here, but let's very briefly touch on mechanics. Chris, do you want to talk about Explore real quick? Because Explore is just a nice, clean mechanic that doesn't actually qualify a lot of cards for our cube, and it's really the only returning mechanic that we have here. So what's going on with Explore?
So Explore is returning from original Ixalan. It was sort of the green-black theme in the original set. So it's a creature-focused mechanic. A creature does the exploring. Basically, you scry one, and if it's a land, you draw it. If it's a non-land, you can either leave it on top of your library or bin it, and the creature that did the exploring gets a +1/+1 counter. Merfolk Branchwalker, which was a 2-drop 2/1 that had this ability, and Jadelight Ranger, which was a 3-drop 2/1 that explored twice, were staples in their standard format. We've played both cards. And you made a note here, and I agree, that it doesn't scale particularly well on expensive creatures because sort of the percentage benefit from the size increase that you're getting becomes progressively less important the larger the creature already is. But we will be talking about a card in green that I think is actually going to be really annoying if you get an Explore trigger on it once.
Yeah, and on top of that, if you're really searching for lands, like you want to explore into lands with early drop creatures, but you don't necessarily want your big creatures to hit that land when you're on 6 mana or something like that.
Right.
Merfolk Branchwalker and Jadelight Ranger really were like the sweet spot on that effect. 2 to 3 mana where you're exploring is really nice. The 1-drops sometimes are a little too small, where even if they get a counter, they're not super good. Whereas, your 2/1 or whatever getting a counter becomes a very real card.
Yeah, and since we're on Explore, Tel, you're a big fan of these tchotchke mechanics. Talk to us about the new map tokens we've got here.
Yeah, so it's a very, very simple mechanic. It just gives us an artifact token with pay 1, tap, sack it, target creature you control explores as a sorcery speed. So notably, you can fizzle it, but the big thing is that this is like a lot of these trinkety tokens is just creating more game objects for us to play with. And there's a lot of ways to use game objects that aren't directly or aren't necessarily something you think of right offhand. I love these sort of effects. Blood was another one where it just kind of just generates incidental value. You'll be able to use this, obviously, if you're looking for a land, if you're digging for a specific card, or if you've got something like Rite of Oblivion where you can sack it. You've got ETB artifact things like in your Affinity Cube. These are going to be easy ways to trigger that. So just these kind of artifact tokens are just something I really like.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, they're good, and it seems Wizards has designed cards thinking that a map token is probably worse on average than like a treasure token or a clue token, which is probably true, but map tokens are only so useful, I think, but they are pieces of cardboard, so they end up having more value than you think they would be. I'm going to handle Descend real quick. We actually will talk about a couple Descend cards. This is point of contention between myself and Teld, which we'll save for the end of the episode in our overall thoughts of the set. But all you really need to know here is that Descend, the word Descend, is being used in multiple ways in this set. First off is whenever a permanent card goes to your graveyard from anywhere, you, the player, have descended. It's not something you have to track. It's not like an emblem type thing like Ascend where you have to keep track of it. It only counts cards, so tokens don't count. But basically there are a couple cards that say, at the beginning of your end step, if you descended, do blah, 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 and we'll see one or two of those. And that just means, did you have a permanent card go to your graveyard? Did you discard it, mill it? Did a creature die or something like that? Not that big of a deal. But then there are also cards that have the Descend 4 and Descend 8 ability, and those are the only numbers being used in this set. And those are cards that track the number of permanents in your graveyard, which is a little bit different. So if you have 4 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, then your Descend 4 abilities are online, and same for Descend 8. It's basically Threshold, but with different numbers instead of 7. And there's also this little one called Fathomless Descent that shows up on about 5 or 6 cards, and that's basically Descend X. It's a Descend ability that changes depending on how many permanent cards are in your graveyard. So a lot going on with Descend. We'll actually see a couple of these, but I'm going to save my opinions about it. This is all about going, farther down into the caves, into the caverns and stuff like that. And we'll just touch on this again whenever the cards come up. It's kind of hard to tell how descending is going to affect a card in the context of Cube because it's not something we've ever really tracked before. Craft is also a new mechanic here that shows up on artifacts, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because are we talking about a craft card today? I don't think we are. If we are, it's just incidental, but it's a mechanic that allows you to take an artifact with craft, exile it by paying a certain amount of mana, and then exile a certain subset of materials, either from your side of the battlefield or from your graveyard, and then it just transforms the craft card into something new. And Teld has a note here that says, Yu-Gi-Oh! This is like textbook synchro summoning, right? Just taking some cards and mashing them up into a new card. We're not going to talk about any craft cards, so we could probably move on from there. I do want to hear your guys' opinions about this one. Discover is probably the last main mechanic in the set, and it's an offshoot of Cascade, if you're familiar with Cascade, but it's a more general version of Cascade. So Discover says, Discover has a number on it, and whenever you discover, you flip cards off the top of your library until you hit a spell that costs, is equal to or less than that value. So Discover 4, you would flip until you hit something that costs 4 or less, and you may cast that card, or you may put it into your hand, which is a big difference with Cascade. How do you guys feel about Discover? It's kind of a surprising, actually, that we would throw this into this set. Cascade is known to be like kind of a problematic mechanic.
I'm not wild about Cascade as a mechanic, not because I think it's necessarily too powerful if it's balanced correctly. And don't get me wrong, I understand that Magic is a game where there's a lot of inherent variance, but it kind of feels like spinning the wheel. Like, I play a lot of Historic Brawl, and sometimes my opponent casts the first sliver and like cascades into Bloodbraid Elf and cascades into something else or whatever, like a good 4-drop, and sometimes they cascade into like Llanowar Elves. So especially for Cube, like I strongly prefer cards that have consistency and I know what they're gonna do.
Yeah, I'm not huge on the whole Cascade Discover either, especially because it seemed like there was a lot more high cost Discover cards in that, like, the good Cascade cards are like 3 and 4 mana, stuff like Bloodbraid Elf or Shardless Agent, where there's a little bit more predictability. A lot of these cards say like Discover 5, right? And you're talking about now you could hit your 1-drop or your 5-drop, and the difference that's going to make on a game is radically different. I'm not a huge fan of effects like this, though I will say, both for and against blue, I think this is a better gameplay mechanic because if you're playing blue, you can hit like a blue instant with it and be able to add it to your hand instead of being forced to use it. Right. And if you're playing against blue, most of these Discover cards, if I'm not mistaken, all of them have to resolve before they actually get their effect. So if you have a counter spell, you can actually not get blown out like you would with, say, a Cascade card.
Yeah, it's not a cast trigger like Cascade is, which also means that it can go on more types of effects. There's a cycle of common lands that you can sacrifice to Discover, which is not something that would work with Cascade because Cascade always has to reference the mana value of a spell that you're casting. We'll have to see how Discover cards actually pay out. And yeah, I think I agree with Chris. It's kind of hard as a cube designer to put cards, like too many cards like this in your cube, because there's so much variability in what they actually do in gameplay that you would just rather play a card that has more stability to it, something that you can rely on, something that's not quite as swingy, though Cascade does lead to some interesting story moments. Just to wrap up the mechanics here, there is a new land subtype called Caves. Not important to this at all, unless you're going for a Caves theme in your cube. This is just not going to impact you. And then there is a new cutesy little addition called a finality counter that's being introduced here. A creature with a finality counter is exiled if it dies, which is just a kind of truncated way to say you can bring back a creature, but it's only coming back one more time. Again, I don't know if we're going to look at anything with a finality counter on it, but that's something that's going to be used moving forward to just denote like a one-time reanimation effect that exiles the creature the next time it would die. With all that being said, we ready to talk about some Rivals of Ixalan cards, y'all?
Hell yeah.
Let's go.
All right, so moving into white, we've got a couple decent cards here. I think we've got about 4 to 5 cards for white. The first one is just a kind of a bread and butter creature. Not the most exciting thing in the world, but I think we all kind of like it. It is Sanguine Evangelist, 2 and a white for a 2/1 rare vampire cleric. It has Battle Cry, and when it enters the battlefield or dies, you make a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. And just a reminder, Battle Cry means when this creature attacks, all of your other attacking creatures get +1/+0. Not a super sexy card, but this is just good value, right? Just bunch of bodies for 3 mana and not super complicated.
I think if you're playing with like all of the most powerful white 3-drops, then this might not scratch the surface for you. We are coming up on replacing Adeline because we're just kind of tired of the effect that it has on the draft and also games. And what I like about Sanguine Evangelist is like all of this information on it is really easy to parse, but it simultaneously does something when you blink it, dies if you're swinging your sacrifice board into the opponent into a 1/1 flyer, makes a token for token stacks.
Good in aggro.
It's good in aggro. I think that this, as a white 3-drop, just sort of ties the room together with a bunch of different things that white is doing natively and then branching into other colors to do. Like, I would play this in my black-white deck. I would play this in my blue-white deck. If I, didn't get all the 3-drops I was looking for, I think it would be fine there. As you mentioned, it's just good in aggro. For us, it'll be a solid card in green-white tokens. I think it just goes in a bunch of decks.
Yeah, not much to say here. It's a little on the boring side in terms of being, interesting card design, but I'm all for this. It's just a rock solid cube card. It's going to go into a variety of different archetypes and even a good sideboard card in some decks that wouldn't be interested in main decking it. And there's going to be plenty of decks that would main deck this.
Yeah.
Yeah, just sleek design, 3 bodies for 3 mana is very good value, even if you don't get them up front. That's almost a Lingering Soul's worth of effects for, just 3 mana, which is fantastic. So yeah, just bread and butter card, fits a lot of different archetypes. Might not be around forever because it's just not super exciting, but good one to start off with, whereas Kellen's a little bit more complicated here. So we have Kellen Daring Traveler. Kellen's back from WoW, apparently. This one is 1 and a white for a 2/3 legendary human fairy scout. Whenever Kellen Daring Traveler attacks, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature with mana value 3 or less, put it in your hand. Otherwise, you may put it into your graveyard. So 2 mana 2/3 that draws a card if the top card is mana value 3 or less creature. If that was all it did, I think we would actually be a little bit happier, but it does have an adventure on it. Apparently Kellen is going to be making some guest appearances with different adventures. It's the only adventure card in this set. The adventure is green mana for a sorcery called Journey On. Create X map tokens where X is 1 plus the number of opponents who control an artifact. So basically that's just kind of throwaway text that says green mana, make a map token. And Chris, I know that we're super excited for the 2 mana creature half of this, but we're not really given any consideration to that adventure, right?
For me personally, I find the adventure tacked onto this annoying because it kind of has this like Selesnya thing on it, and we're just going to play it as a white card.
Yeah, we're more or less ignoring the fact that there is an adventure here at all, even though if you have access to green mana, you'll obviously use the adventure when you can, right?
I think sometimes it's just going to be right to play this out on 2, though, even if you can cast the adventure, because it's not super impactful. Sometimes I think people hold adventure creatures for longer than they're supposed to because they're trying to get maximum value. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a weird adventure. I don't know if there's map token making in white broadly across the set, but they're doing this like 2-color adventure thing now. I think this could have just been a mono white card, but the 2-drop is quite good.
Yeah, it's a solid little creature, and we're going to ignore the fact. Like, this isn't the type of thing where you have it in your white deck and you feel obligated to, like, find green sources like a Sungrass Prairie or something like that. You just leave the Sungrass Prairie out altogether and just play another Plains and ignore that there's an adventure here. So for the purposes of like cube design, it is kind of annoying that there's a green adventure tacked on, because that is like an indication we should be using a gold slot for it. But the adventure is so insignificant here that we're just gonna strike that out. You know, we're gonna get the Sharpie and basically cross that out and play this as a white 2-drop, as Chris said.
It's worth noting, too, that even if you don't hit something to draw, if it's a little later in the game and you're already on, like, 4 mana in your white aggro deck and your top card is a land, like, binning that isn't drawing a card, but it's kind of close.
Get you closer to action, I mean.
Right, so this is either going to draw you action, or, like, later in the game when you really do not need to draw another land, it's going to get you closer to action, which I maybe think of that as closer to draw a card than maybe it actually is, but I think this is just going to be solid mid-range value, and it's just like, it's finely statted for aggressive decks too. If you're playing a white aggro deck, most of your creatures are going to be mana value 3 or less anyway, so if you have like 16 creatures in your deck and like 2 of them are 4-drops, this is just going to draw like 14 cards. It's going to conceivably draw 14 cards out of your library, which is not bad.
No. You guys ready to get lost?
Yeah.
Yeah, some huge equity there of just being able to yell that out whenever you cast this removal spell. But got a new, probably the best removal spell that we're getting in this set. Get Lost is 1 and a white for a rare instant. Destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. Its controller creates 2 map tokens. This is just obviously, I think, a very solid removal spell, but the conversation that has to come up is, where does this lie in comparison to like Fateful Absence and Deck and Stone?
Yeah, I think it's probably relatively comparable to those cards, maybe a little better. I think the thing is that 1 map tokens being sorcery speed means there's a lot less times to be flexible after someone uses Get Lost on you, right? So sometimes when you get Fateful Absence, it's in combat, and you know now that you've got this clue token, you can sequence your mana in a way that works. Sorcery speed makes this a little more awkward, and also the impact of any given map or exploring once isn't really as big as generally just drawing a card generically would be. I think this card in aggro is just going to be almost a strict upgrade to Fateful Absence, where you're going to do this during their end step to kill a blocker, and then just they're going to die before they get to untap with it. And then in control, it's obviously like the amount of value you're getting isn't as good. And then control might be able to blow you out when you try to go for the Explorer, or they might be able to keep your board relatively clean in the first place. I think this card's really powerful. I don't think there's too much to say here, honestly. I think it's just a really, really powerful Doomblade. I think it's got the lowest opportunity cost of these 3 effects.
The sorcery speed on the map tokens is a pretty big deal, because sometimes you Fateful Absence your opponent, and like they just weren't able to double spell or spend all their mana in the previous turn, so they just have 2 mana up.
Yeah.
And if you Fateful Absence your opponent and they already have mana up that they weren't able to spend, Fateful Absence effectively becomes destroy target creature, planeswalker, your opponent draws a card. So if your opponent has mana up when you hit their thing with Get Lost, they still have to spend mana on their own turn when they might want to be deploying sorcery speed effects to trigger the map tokens.
Also, this hits enchantments, which is like, it's not insignificant, right? It's not going to be something that comes up all the time, but there are a number of relatively powerful enchantments in this environment that this can still tag.
Yeah, and in higher power environments than ours, like being able to hit your opponent's like sneak attack is pretty damn good. You know, I'm sure that there are others that are not coming to mind right now.
Yeah, oppositions and stuff like that.
Yeah, opposition. Even in our cube, like a resolved Meathook Massacre dies to this.
Imagine you spend your 7 mana to slam your Virtue of Persistence. Your opponent taps 2, wins target game.
Oh god.
Well, you're probably fine there because Virtue of Persistence already did its thing. That's the glory of that card. But yeah, I mean, this is just a solid removal spell. It's worth noting, too, if your opponent just doesn't have creatures, they can't use the map token. Right. Or if you're a control deck that just has like a lot of pinpoint removal, you can remove the creature that they're targeting with map tokens in response, and it fizzles. Or if you're playing against a control deck and you happen to hit like their Leyline Binding or Banish and Light type card, and they just don't have creatures in their deck, they have no use for the map tokens at all. So you can tell by the design of the card, the fact that it makes 2 map tokens is just clear indication on Wizards' behalf, at least on R&D's behalf, that they believe a map token is significantly less valuable than a clue token, or even like this would be way worse if it gave your opponent 2 treasure tokens or something like that. But
that would be brutal.
Yeah.
That would be really bad.
So, very good removal spell. Probably one of White's best removal spells just right off the bat, and we'll see how it stacks up against your Fateful Absences and your Declarations and Stones. Neat little white sorcery here. Just simple card, Help in Hand. Single white mana for an uncommon sorcery. Return target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, kind of unearth, but puts the creature in tap. No cycling, obviously. Still pretty good, though, right? When you scale to the unrestricted environment and you're getting back 2-drops and 3-drops that are at the quality that you see in these cubes, this is just a good effect, yeah?
Yeah, so White has a number of 2 and 3-drops that if they sit on the battlefield, they're going to generate more than a card's worth of value. Like, in a blue-white blink deck, this buys back your Soul Herder. This will buy back your Lurrus. If I'm playing black-white and I get an opportunity to draft Unearth and Helping Hand, I'm going to put them both in my deck if I have a Lurrus in my deck. You know, even just like creatures that have a good ETB ability, this will buy those back. You know, like if I cast Elite Spellbinder and you remove it because you don't want to die to it in the air, and the next turn I just like play a land, Helping Hand it back, disrupt your hand again, and play another 3-drop. That's a very powerful line. It is worth noting that it doesn't have the cycling, right? So sometimes this is going to be in your hand and you're just not going to have anything to do with it, but I like this as an insurance policy for your engine-y creatures that generate more than their mana's worth of value when they're on the battlefield. Even Luminarch Aspirant is like an excellent target to get back with this.
Any hesitation that this puts the creature in tapped?
It's a downside, but I'm not that worried about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure the decks that are really going to want this are going to care a ton, because like Chris mentioned, a lot of these cards are going to be value engines you don't really want to block with in the first place. The problem with Unearth, and it is a good card, we do run it, but the problem with Unearth and the problem with Lurrus in black decks is that a lot of your creatures are already naturally recursive, and they don't have a lot of impact because their recursion is the upside. But White gets a lot more stat line attributed, or a lot more text box attributed to giving their mana's worth of effects that isn't tied to that recursion. And I think opening up your ability to do that and opening up the number of color pairs you can get that sort of effect for that advantage is a big deal. Yeah, I think that I was a little low on this at first compared to Unearth, but it really is in a much stronger color for the sort of effect that we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's obviously strictly worse than Unearth, but I mean, Unearth kind of spoiled us with a bunch of upside, whereas this is like what I feel like this sort of card should be anyway. Unearth just has upside that it doesn't need to be good. It just has that. So when we see a comparable effect that's worse now, it's like, oh, that's not as good as Unearth. And well, that's because Unearth is kind of pushed as a card, right? A lot of simple effects in White here. One more I want to just touch on real quick, because I don't think we're actually going to play this card. It's not suitable to our exact environment, but it has a really strong effect. This is Dusk Rose Reliquary. A single white mana for an uncommon artifact. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature. It has Ward 2, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile a creature or artifact until it leaves the battlefield. So a 1 mana Banishing Light that catches any artifact or creature with Ward 2, but you have to sacrifice an artifact or creature. I mean, how much expendable stuff do you need in order for this to be a card that you actually want in your environment? Because it's very high upside. You know, it's a 1 mana removal spell that can snag your opponent's 5-drop or 6-drop. But you do have to sacrifice something as a cost. And it is artifact or creature, so a lot of times you'll have a random treasure floating around. Like, does this get there for the unrestricted cube?
Probably not, but this is an absolute banger constructed card.
It's powerful. It reads to me more like a Bone Splinters type effect, where it's like sack a creature, kill a creature. But the fact that you could sack an artifact to it, like your Thraben Inspector turned this on, your Spyglass Siren, which we'll talk about, turns this on. I think there's enough incidental artifacts floating around these days that you might be able to get away with this, but it's not like the cleanest include. Like, it's not always going to do the thing, which I know Chris is the I want my cards to always do the thing person. So yeah, I wanted to touch on this one because the upside of it's really powerful. I think you probably need to be doing some sort of white sacrifice or artifact theme in your cube before you're comfortable taking a slot on this.
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to dedicate a slot in our white section to the black-white sacrifice deck, I mean, this would probably just be good in the tokens deck too.
Yeah.
right? Because it's so cheap. In your environment, maybe if you have a ton of things that are making artifact tokens, this becomes valuable. But for a lot of creature-centric environments, this is basically going to be sack a creature, exile a creature, and I think you're only really going to want to do that if you're making fodder. So it's not universal enough for me to be excited about it for our cube. I'm sure it'll be cool for certain environments. Have you thought about this for the Affinity Cube?
Oh yeah, it's going right in. It's the perfect kind of removal spell for that environment because it's also vulnerable there too, which is what I would want for an effect that's this cheap and efficient at snagging whatever your opponent's going to play. Let's go ahead and move into blue. With that being said, blue actually got like the lion's share of what we're going to talk about today, like quite a bit of cards. Chris, why don't you go ahead and talk to us about Malcolm, because I know you like the looters. And I know you're a big Rona stan, so tell us about Malcolm here.
So Malcolm is 2 mana for a 2/1 flash flying Siren Pirate. Whenever Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel deals combat damage to a player, put a chorus counter on it. Draw a card, then discard a card. If there are 4 or more chorus counters on Malcolm, you may cast the discarded card without paying its mana cost. So if we just ignore the chorus counter stuff, it's 2/1 flash flyer that loots on damage. Like that's pretty excellent for blue fish style decks, because you want to have the right combination of cards in your hand when you're playing blue decks, period, right? You want the right balance of counters. If you're playing a blue creature deck, some creatures, like you don't want a handful of all creatures or a handful of all counters. This is going to help you with that. It's an evasive creature that's dealing damage in the air. And the other thing I like about it is, like, there are going to be games where the chorus thing happens. This is an evasive creature. If your opponent doesn't remove it and it stays on the battlefield, it threatens to generate a massive tempo advantage and sculpt your hand. And it's cheap enough that, like, no matter what your opponent removes it with, even if it's a 1-mana removal spell, you're not getting completely blown out. So I like that it's 2/1 flash flyer looter that also threatens to do something really powerful, and your opponent is probably going to need to burn a removal spell on it.
Yeah, I like that it's a looter that's not just like a throwaway body. Like, it's actually pressuring your opponent. It's engaging in combat. It's putting a meaningful clock on your opponent while also doing the looting. And we've been spoiled with looters over the last like year and a half. You know, Ledger Shredder, Suspicious Stowaway, to the point where we have like 3 or 4 of them in our section now, and we're like, how many looters do we actually need? And I know when Suspicious Stowaway came out, I was excited because I was like, Merfolk Looter is a card that hasn't stood the test of time. This is what a looter needs to look like in the modern day. And, you know, Malcolm is just kind of, here's a looter that is also a threat that your opponent actually has to deal with instead of letting it just sit on board and not engage in combat. So, yeah, I mean, this is a simple card if you ignore the chorus text. Just decent body, deals damage, loots when it hits. And that's pretty much good enough for us.
Yeah, it sort of feels like the Flash came along for free on this one too, because I'm pretty sure if you remove Flash from this, we would still play it.
Yes.
Yeah, and Flash is like the instant selling point where we don't really even have to think about it, but we would still play this without Flash, I think.
Well, the more we've designed and worked with blue, and like as our creature deck in blue has like dramatically evolved over time, this has the 2 keywords that I want every single blue creature to have: Flash and Flying.
Yeah. The more of that you combine to, like, we have so many of these at this point that they all, every time you add one to the cube, it bolsters the power of the rest and bolsters your counter spells and all that good stuff. So good addition to the pool. I'm excited to see if that chorus text ever goes off. I don't think it will. Like 1 in 20 games, but when it does, it's going to be super cool.
You know, what's actually going to happen is you're going to play Malcolm on turn 2. You know, you're going to play Bloated Contaminator on turn 3, and then we're going to ramp to the chorus counters.
Yeah, we're gonna proliferate up our chorus counters, even though I've hit my opponent like for 20 damage already. Tel, do you want to briefly touch on this card called Spyglass Siren? I think you were excited about this one.
Yeah, so Spyglass Siren is 1 blue for a 1/1 with flying, so it is a flying man. And when it ETBs, it makes a map token. I don't know if it'd be a stretch to say this is probably the best flying man ever. Like, we talked about it. I think it's a little too underpowered for what the unrestricted cube is ultimately doing. We don't necessarily... When we talk about a blue 1-drop, we kind of want the sort of value you're getting from something like a Sleep Curse Fairy. And this doesn't quite get there, but this was a really exciting card overall. You know, it's a a cheap 1-mana tempo card that threatens to be a 2-power flyer, threatens to draw a card, brings a lot of little extra value. You know, it's ticking the boxes on the what's it called, rectangle theory, where you're just making more cardboard pieces.
Shout out to Lord Tupperware there.
Yeah, so this is just a solid little 1-drop. I think, like, I talked about it as a possibility in the unrestricted cube, but I just think our flying men isn't really where we're at, even when they bring along extra cards.
It's where we used to be. Blue tempo deck, when we originally started designing it with the card pool that we had like Curious Obsession and like Grazilax, which is that 3-drop that draws a card every time one of your creatures does combat damage to the opponent. We had ninjas in here for a while. That didn't really work out. If you are playing a cube that has a Flying Men deck, either you're playing like a Curiosity style deck, or you're playing like a Ninja style tempo deck, or some way for your Flying Men to become more than the sum of their parts, I agree with Teld. I think this is probably the best one they've made.
Yeah, it's not hard for a 1-drop that comes with some sort of extra trinket to be good, right? You can find a use for that trinket even if you're not just sacrificing it as the map token, you know? Your Thraben Inspector is good for that exact reason. So yeah, I don't think I'm here on this card for unrestricted cube, but there are cubes that would support this style of play, and this is very good. It's no Lantern Bearer, but, you know, everything can't be Lantern Bearer.
Facts.
It's a cool little card. This next one's really cool. We didn't really talk in the mechanics, but there's a lot of double face cards and stuff like that, and this is one of the new gods in the set. The way the gods work in this set is instead of being indestructible or something like that, when they die, they transform into a land that has some sort of condition where it can actually transform back into the creature. So they need to be exiled to be permanently gone, but you do have to jump through some hoops to get them to transform back into the actual god. So the blue one is, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, but Oher Pakpatik, Deepest Epoch, I believe is how you pronounce the epoch.
Epoch, yeah.
Epoch, yeah, who knows. 2 blue for a 4/3 mythic rare god with flying. So 4 mana, 4/3 flyer. Whenever you cast an instant from your hand, it gains rebound, which means that it exiles on resolution, and then you cast it from exile on your next upkeep. And when Oher Pakpatik dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control with 3 time counters on it. The land is Temple of Cyclical Time. You can tap it to add blue and remove a time counter from it. And you can pay 2 and a blue and tap it to transform it back into the god, but only if there are no time counters on it, and only as a sorcery. So that basically means you have to tap this for mana 3 times, and then you have to activate an ability for 3 mana to turn it back into the creature, which I don't think is going to happen very often. That's actually like 4 turns worth of tapping it for various stuff, especially since it transforms tapped already. But let's just focus on the front half of this card. 4 mana, 4/3 flyer that dies into a land and rebounds your instants. Only instants, not sorceries and instants, and a lot of blue instants happen to be counter spells, which don't work with rebound. Where are we at on this? I know we're all testing the card, but I think there's a little bit of speculation about how it's actually going to perform.
I'm not a fan of the 3 toughness on it.
Yeah, I think we're testing this, but I mean, I think we all kind of expect ultimately the 5 toughness on Kefnet is going to be a bigger benefit. But this one, between the art and the design of it and just all of that, I think it was too cool not to test. But yeah, there's definitely some concern here. 3 toughness means that your opponent can bolt this for 1 mana, and sure, you get a land out of the deal, which is really nice. It's very, very big in your control deck, but you did lose a 4-to-1 mana exchange, which is game losing in a lot of scenarios. Kefnet would have bricked their board. Anytime they have any sort of exile effect, Kefnet still would have been shuffled back in, so this gets completely savaged by something like Incendiary Flow. I will say it's also very, very powerful with adventures, so if I understand correctly, the way it works with adventures is if your adventure is an instance, so like Brazen Borrower, Horned Lock Whale, or Bonecrusher Giant, something like that, you can rebound the adventure, and then you can either recast the instant side on the rebound and put it back into exile to cast the creature side later, or you can cast the creature side for free, which is pretty cool.
Let's assume for a second that this was like a 4/4 or 4/5 or something like that. It wasn't super vulnerable, so it has an obvious presence on board. How good is the ability to just rebound your instance? Like, what is that doing for us? Is that, I mean, it bricks on counter spells, which is the vast majority of the instants that we have in blue, so you're already kind of diminishing how many cards this works with. But I mean, let's say you just get a cantrip off. You wait till 5 mana, you go Oher Pakpatik plus Consider. Is that good? I mean, that's good enough, right? Like, you just basically turn all of your instants into another version of themselves. That seems pretty strong to me.
Rebounding your, 4 mana, look at some number of cards, draw 2. It's pretty good.
Notably, this doesn't work with Memory Deluge. I mean, it technically works because, you can rebound it, but you look at 0 cards.
Yeah, Memory Deluge is an interesting card. It doesn't work with Torrential Gearhulk either.
Chris, you could tell Chris just fought himself to he put one foot on the soapbox and he's like, now's not the time.
Now is not the time. Now is not the time.
Is this land ever turning back into the creature? Teld said he thought that would happen, but it comes into play tapped. So the turn it dies, it comes into play tapped. You untap. You tap it for mana, you untap, you tap it for mana, you untap, you tap it for mana, and then you have to wait another turn after that. So you're actually talking 5 turns after it dies is when you can turn it back into the creature.
Yeah, notably, I missed that. I missed that on the first couple of reads. It was really just now when you read the card's text out loud that I noticed that it comes into play tapped as a land. I thought it came into play untapped.
Yeah. So this is just not ever coming back as the creature, right? Not in most realistic games.
I think it could, as Teld mentioned here in the notes, I think it certainly could in a control deck. And in a control deck, this turning into a land and effectively ramping you in exchange for dying, I think, is going to open up the possibility for you to resolve a 3-mana value engine or threat, Snowbally Threat, and then hold up 3 mana to interact with your opponent. My problem with that, though, is I think a control deck would rather have a creature that doesn't trade with 2-drops.
Yeah.
They played it safe on this one, and probably for good reason. We don't know how these big splashy mythics that die into a mana source are going to play out. I suspect that the fact that you just get a land when these creatures die is way stronger than the initial impression will be. I think you'll just notice that you just got a land. It's like your opponent gave you, it turns whatever removal spell they used into Path to Exile because you're just always up a mana source, which is a huge downside. It's why I hate the card Assassin's Trophy, But we'll see how this plays out. We're going to actually talk about a couple other gods here, which is funny because I didn't think we would be talking about any of them. But let's go ahead and move things along to Kite Sail Larcenist. And I'm going to give this one to Chris because I think... Chris, there's 2 3-drops that are basically competing side by side here as new additions, and I think most of us agree that the Larcenist is the better one. So, Chris, why don't you talk about this one, and then I'll take the other 3-drop.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I'm pretty sure when we did the, what we were looking for in blue episode, I think you basically called out that you wanted this card, right? You wanted a blue...
Teld was talking about more ways to deal with permanents that have resolved in blue. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, Kitesail Larcenist is 2 and a blue for a 2/3 flying Ward 1 human pirate. When it ETBs for each player controls, for as long as Kitesail Larcenist remains on the battlefield, the chosen permanents become treasure artifacts. With tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and lose all other abilities. So basically in Heads Up Magic, this is going to come down. It's up to 1, so if it comes down on an empty board, it's not like it's going to turn itself into a treasure token. But it basically just turns your opponent's best creature, or if they have a really powerful artifact, into a treasure token. Which is obviously different than a Bannister-style priest card, which removes it from the battlefield. But I think in some ways... turning it into a treasure against certain targets, especially certain green targets, is actually going to be better. Because when your Banisher Priest gets removed, if the creature that it exiled has an ETB, they get that ETB again, which can often be worth up to a half a card, worth of value. And while the target, if Kitesail Larcenist dies or is removed in some capacity, is effectively going to have haste, I think that's mitigated somewhat by the fact that it denies ETB abilities. And this is one thing I haven't really thought about too much. The opponent can sacrifice the creature to get 1 mana worth of tempo on their next turn if they don't have a way to deal with the Larcenist, but I think you're happy with that trade.
Yeah, they're never going to actually... that's just not a thing they're ever going to do unless they're desperate, and if they're desperate for mana that much, you're probably in an okay position.
Yeah, that feels like a win. I mean, it could work out poorly for you, I guess, in the context of a game, but I think most of the time you're going to be relatively happy when that happens.
Yeah, I agree. And this has the magic word, flying.
Yeah, I think the fact that this card is actually, substantially better in combat than your average Banisher Priest. It has the 3rd point of toughness, flying, and Ward 1. It is just... the stat line is really pushed on this relative to what we expect from this sort of card.
Mm-hmm. It contributes to combat, which these types of cards don't normally do. And the reason I don't like these Banisher Priest cards very much, or I think they're overrated, is the whole your opponent gets their card back and re-triggers their ETB thing. And as Chris pointed out, turning it into something else instead of exiling it and putting it back into play means that your opponent doesn't get to double up on their ETB effects, which always feels like it turns the game around when that sort of thing happens.
This isn't quite target creature opponent controls phases out, but it's a lot better body than I would have expected from the conversation. Because like I would just have expected the blue Banisher Priest to be literally a Banisher Priest, and this is a lot better than that.
Do you guys foresee ever targeting any of your own stuff for the treasure token here? Because you can choose one of your things to turn into treasure. Maybe you want to protect something.
I don't think you're constructing your deck with that in mind, but there could be situations coming up where you play against a Wrath heavy control deck and you want to like tuck one of your cards because you're ahead on board. That being said, you do have counter magic, so there's that. But anyways, you could do that. There's could be a situation where you want to get rid of a card that's like a 1/1 token and be able to turn it into mana to have a big explosive turn on the following turn, or be able to hold up counter magic on the turn you play the largest on like turn 4. So there's a couple of spots where I could definitely see it being worthwhile to turn some sort of either protect something or turn something insignificant into a mana source for you. That's just going to be a oops, I did this kind of thing. It's going to be a happy little accident, as we like to say.
Thanks, Ross. This is just a great little tempo card, right? This card's awesome, and the tempo deck in our cube has been quite good lately too. So excited to see that one. I'm really high on this next one. I got the impression that you guys aren't as high on it, but this is one of those test cards where I feel like it's going to perform really, really well. Tishana's Tidebinder is 2 and a blue for a 3/2 rare Merfolk Wizard with Flash. When it enters the battlefield, counter up to one target activated or triggered ability. If an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. So the 3 mana Flash stifles something, but the source of the ability that you're stifling is turned off while this sits on board. And notably, you can use that to counter a Planeswalker loyalty ability, and then the Planeswalker doesn't do anything. You could turn off an equipment in response to the equip, and then the equipment just sits there not doing anything. But notably, this interacts with every enter the battlefield effect too, right? You counter an enter battlefield effect, and then the creature has no abilities. And if not enter the battlefield ability, then a triggered ability from an attack trigger. If you go through just our cube alone and you look at all the creatures, I guarantee you 90% of them have an activated or triggered ability that Tishana's Tidebender interacts with. And of course, the downside with this card is that it is a 3/2, so it's frail, right? You can shut down your opponent's creatures all they want, but if they're just giant creatures, they're still going to be able to smash you with them. They just lose their abilities. They don't lose their stats. And a 3/2 doesn't clock your opponent super hard or get through blockers or anything like that. So we'll see how much the body matters here, but you usually will counter an ETB. So even if this ends up dying, you got a little bit of value off of it. I like it in comparison to something like Nimble Obstructionist, which is the Cyclone card, because you get the body and the counter spell here rather than having to choose one or the other, where, Nimble Obstructionist cycled, so you drew a card off of it. But I think this card is priced to move. I think it interacts with enough stuff, not just enough stuff, but so much stuff, that the ability is the ability is going to be very good. The thing I'm skeptical about is how this body is going to stack up, because they kill it, they get their creature, fully unlocked.
Yeah, I actually think that it seems to be to me that people who like this card versus don't like this card, it's kind of an A-B thing, right? Do you see this card as a fragile 3/2 that is like a pithing needle? Or do you see this as Stifle that brings a 3/2 along with it and occasionally has better upside than that? Because that's how I see it. I don't actually think the pithing needle part of this card, where it removes the text permanently, is why I'm putting this in my deck. I would put a 3/2 that stifles something in my deck because that's awesome. I think that this card is going to be quite good because the amount of flash and instant speed interaction in blue is already so high that this adds another layer of... Take a card like obvious examples, any ETB trigger, but something like Blade Splicer, you are putting in your deck specifically for that ETB trigger. And if you pass with this up, your opponent jams Blade Splicer and you tag this, congratulations opponent, you have a 1/1 in play. The number of options that this gives is really high. The one thing I would have liked to have seen, and I actually missed this at first because again, being a Magic player, I can't read. And so I thought that you could target a creature and just kind of strip all of its abilities off. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that blue card being reality, but we're not quite there yet. And that card's going to be sick, right? If you could proactively use this to your opponent ships the questing beast and you just, no triggers involved, you just slam this and, strip all the text off the questing beast, so it's just a 4/4.
Yeah, no, there has to be something on the stack to counter in order to interact with that creature in the first place. But I think you hit the nail on the head. If you ignored the whole shutting off abilities thing, 3 mana 3/2 flash counter an activated or triggered ability I think is already good enough. Even the whole keeping that thing locked down thing, I think is just bonus.
Yeah, Stifle's a really powerful effect. The issue with Stifle is typically that you don't ever get a whole card's worth of value with Stifle in most cases. Unless you're hitting a fetch land or something, your Stifle isn't getting an entire card's worth of value. And while a 3/2 for 3 is not exciting, the Stifle was already worth most of a card worth of value. So the 3/2 doesn't have to be that good in order for it to get you over the hump and be worth more than a card.
Yeah. I think it's good. And it has that magic flash keyword, which I guess it has to for this ability.
I think Chris is a little less optimistic about it, if I recall, though.
I think I could convince Chris a lot higher if they didn't give us another premium blue 3-drop in this same exact set.
That's part of it. The slot for us is getting super crowded. I will say that in higher power cubes, I don't know if this is good enough for legacy cubes or not. I couldn't say. But there are an insane range of incredibly powerful activated and triggered abilities in the vintage cube, and this interacts with those, and those environments, unless you're playing specifically against aggro, tend to be a lot less creature heavy, and in that environment I'm more optimistic that the 3/2 is going to be a meaningful contributor to clocking your opponent. As it stands for a really creature heavy cube like ours, I would have liked to see this as a 2/1 flyer instead of a 3/2, but that honestly may have been too good. I don't know. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, so these blue 3-drops, we're trying both of them out. We'll see how they stack up. But like Chris said, we've got a lot of really good blue 3-drops at this point. Chris, do you want to talk to me about the boat?
I do. I love the boat. This is Subterranean Schooner. It's 1 and a blue for a 3/4 artifact vehicle. Whenever a Subterranean Schooner attacks, target creature that crewed it this turn explores. Crew 1.
Crew 1.
Gentlemen, I just received a message in a bottle. Detective Pinchy would like you to know it is Captain Pinchy now.
Yes, Teld has a dream of crew in this with a 0/3 crab, along with some other creatures, just to start exploring with his crab.
Look, we all have goals in Cube, and some of ours are beyond mere mortals' comprehension. Okay.
I mean, we just got done talking about a bunch of flash and tempo cards. Chris, where do you envision playing this card in our cube?
So I think that this is a fish deck card, and that's the only place that it's going to go. So what's sick about this is it's a 3/4 for 2. Blue creatures tend to be pretty small, but the crew cost is literally 1. So you can crew it with any creature that's an actual creature not generated by a spell in our entire cube. And we play a lot of blue flyers. A lot of blue creatures tend to have flying or be relatively small. So notably, when this attacks, 3/4 is going to get in there if you back this up with any amount of removal or counter magic or whatever. And notably, the creature that crewed it explores. And what I like so much about that is if you crew this with a small flyer, putting a +1/+1 counter onto a flyer is, especially if it was small to begin with, is a lot more valuable than putting it on a random ground creature, because your flyers are getting in for damage, right? If your opponent's generated 1/1 flying tokens, if you explore over a card a non-land card once, all of a sudden your Malcolm is now a 3/2, so they'd have to trade 2 tokens for it instead of 1. So I think this is going to push damage in the tempo deck. And the other thing that I like about it, if you're doing what we're doing and you're playing a high volume of cheap flash creatures in your blue section to support that blue creature deck, if I don't attack with this, if I just leave this up untapped and you're my aggro opponent and you're attacking into me, you have to respect that I might flash in Fairy Mastermind and crew this and block and eat one of your creatures. That's something you're going to have to take into account now. So it has defensive and offensive applications. We'll just have to see. It's a narrow card, it is for a deck. So if you don't have a flex slot available in your cube for like a relatively narrow effect. Maybe you don't want to test this, but if you're playing a tempo deck with small blue creatures, I think this is something you should look at.
Yeah, all the knobs are in the right places for this one. They talk about that a lot with vehicles, knobs being all the different numbers you can change on the card, and it feels like they pushed all of them, right? The mana cost, the crew cost is as low as it can get, the power and toughness are high. Like I could foresee any of those knobs being turned like to crew 2 or to 3 mana or to like a 2/4 or something like that, and it'd be a little less exciting. But all three of the Bane like number knobs have been turned to the to make this a competitive card.
Yeah, we've come a long way since the Dimmer submarine.
Dimmer. There he goes with Dimmer again.
I would also like to say this card, it's a little narrow, but it interacts really favorably with Sleep Curse Fairy. So you can crew this and then use the 2 mana to untap the Sleep Curse Fairy and then ship them both.
Yeah, you probably put those in the same deck too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this boat seems cool. Very aggressive for a blue card. But yeah, it's very awesome. I just like that your opponent's going to have to deal with the boat, and your creatures, either you're drawing cards because you're exploring into lands, or your other creatures are getting bigger while they have to deal with the boat. So by the time they actually do deal with your 2 mana 3/4, you've probably got like 2 extra +1/+1 counters and maybe a card draw off of it. Plus it's not vulnerable to sorcery speed removal most of the time. So your opponent wraths, you just play another creature crew, get the thing going again. So very powerful card here.
So when your opponent when your opponent blocks the boat, right, you attack with it and they put a creature in front of it. Is the boat running them over, or are they like getting captured and being made to walk the plank? Like, what's the lore here?
Yeah,
can we get a lore judge?
They're walking the plank. I mean, isn't that when a boat kills somebody, like, I don't know. Like, is everybody swimming in the ocean and the boat hits them? I don't know. I'm not qualified to be a lore judge, unfortunately. Let's talk about these 2 counter spells real quick. So the first one is the more obviously powerful of them. Confounding Riddle, 2 and a blue for an instant. It's uncommon. Choose 1. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. Put 1 in your hand, the rest in the graveyard, or counter target spell unless its controller pays 4 mana. So a strict upgrade to Supreme Will, which has been around for 5 or 6 years and has always been like imminently cubable, even though we cut it recently. But this is a strict upgrade on both halves, right? Instead of putting the cards on the bottom of your library for the impulse mode, you put them in your graveyard, which is almost always an advantage. And the counter spell is just better. It's counters for 4 instead of 3. So just, we cut Supreme Will not too long ago because it felt like it was underperforming, and this is a bump to both modes. Does that basically get this slot put back into our cube?
Certainly worth trying. I don't know if there's a lot to say here. I think this is obviously just mostly strict upgrade unless you're at risk of decking, I guess. And on both ends, it's just an improvement, and we'll see. I like that this is the kind of effect that if your control deck doesn't necessarily need to counter something, you can go dig for an answer to something else. I like this sort of effect, and I'm glad they pushed it a little bit because Supreme Will just wasn't quite standing the test of time. Much better in Peasant, too. I know we're not talking about that here, but very good in the Rise from the Tide decks.
That's strike 1 on Peasant's tell. You get 2 more. You get 2 more, and then you're out. Yeah, I think I agree that we don't really need to say too much about it. It's a strict upgrade over a card that's always kind of been cubable anyway. The other counterspell is, I think, a little more interesting. Not as good, clearly, but interesting for sure. And that's our last blue card, Out of Air, 2 blue, instant, common. This spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets a creature, and it counters target spells. So you're looking at 2 blue to counter anything, or blue to counter a creature. And we had a little bit of conversation about how good that actually is. I know we were excited. We jumped on it right away as like, oh, this might be better than Essence Scatter, but I'm not sure. Like, you cast it, on turn 2, you have to have blue up, which is, not always achievable.
It might be better. The thing is, I think that blue decks tend to be very blue mana hungry, and I'm just not sure how often that blue instead of the 1 blue on Essence Scatter is going to bite you.
It might just regularly be as castable as Essence Scatter. It's hard to tell, honestly. But, I mean, we've had situations where we've had Counterspell in our hand and couldn't cast it on turn 2, right?
Yeah, that comes up.
That comes up.
Yeah. I was originally thinking this would just be a better Essence Scatter, but I do think the number of games I've had where Counterspell kind of can't come online until turn 3 or 4, I think the decks that would want an Essence Scatter in the first place can't afford for that to happen, right? They need to counter when it's important to counter something, they need to counter it. I do wonder, like, obviously it'd be strictly better if they did this, but I do wonder if at some point in design this had been, cost blue 1 less to counter a creature spell, and then they decided to change it just to not power creep out Essence Scatter, given that that card is in standard at the moment, I believe.
That would have been crazy power creep.
I mean, that would be a literal strict upgrade. We wouldn't even be talking about it.
It would, but like, would that be good though? I guess is the question. Like, do you want, like, the question really comes down to is like a 4-mana counter spell that doesn't do anything else actually playable, even if it could get counters creatures on 2, right? Like, how much better is that than Essence Scatter? I guess would be the question.
There comes a point in the game, I think, where as a control deck, if it's gone long, you don't have an arbitrary amount of mana, but you will spend 4 mana to counter a spell and not feel terrible about it. We're a very creature-heavy environment, so I think the more flexible casting cost on Essence Scatter, like, if you're playing Essence Scatter and you're controlling blue deck in our cube, you're almost certainly going to be presented with a target for it. I could see in less creature-heavy environments, the flexibility on this maybe being an upside, but, like, outside of the arena card pool, people have access to, like, the actual good blue counter magic, so they're probably not considering this. I don't know. I'm going back and forth on whether or not we should just test it to see if it just feels better most of the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting design that's a little hard to grok, like, by comparison without actually playing it. But I think I'm on board with, like, maybe test it, see how it feels, and obviously revert back to Essence Scatter. I do want to say before we move on from blue, I think the counter spell design here is really clever for this set because of the existence of Discover. So the fact that they made one of the counter spells a modal counter spell means you can still discover into it and get free value off of casting the impulse mode instead of just like putting it in your hand and not getting your 3 mana's worth of free spell. And then obviously Out of Air is like really a 2 mana spell, but it has a mana value of 4, so it's a counter spell that misses all of your like Discover 3s and stuff like that. You're not going to accidentally just flip into your counter spell off of Discover 3, which I think is just clever design, making the counter spells work with the existence of which they didn't have to do because Discover already lets you just pick up the card if you can't cast it, but you still get your like free mana values worth, which is nice.
Yeah, sure.
Black, I think, might be the second deepest color as far as stuff that we're getting. A lot of creatures to talk about here. And it's in the contract when we decided to start this podcast that anytime we get a black 1-drop, Chris is contractually obligated to talk about it. So I can't take it away from you. Stalactite Stalker, you want to kick off black for us, Chris?
Yeah, this is a really encouraging card, by the way, just because black 1-drops were in a pretty sorry state even just a handful of years ago, and they seem to be printing them with more regularity now, which is cool. Stalactite Stalker is a single black mana for a 1/1 Goblin Rogue with Menace. At the beginning of your turn, if you descended this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Stalactite Stalker. And then it has 2 and a black, sacrifice it, target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is Stalactite Stalker's power. So it's a 1/1 Menace as a baseline, which is probably not something that you would just play. But if anything trades in combat while this is on board, it just grows into a 2/2 Menace, and that is well worth 1 mana. And once it becomes a 2/2 Menace, the sacrifice mode suddenly starts to hit a much wider range of like potentially valuable targets for you to take off the battlefield. So I really think you only have to trigger this one time. So I see this playing out in like 2 ways. Either it's your 1 mana play, because it has Menace, it's going to chip in some damage, and then your threats that you develop on turn 2 and 3, if things develop such that like you're concerned that Stalactite Stalker is going to get eaten in combat. Now, notably, like if they're devoting 2 creatures to blocking your 1/1, your 3-power 2-drop is probably getting in for damage, so you may still even just want to do that. But at some point, like you're going to be attacking with your 2 and 3 mana threats, and if you trade once in combat, this becomes a 2/2, and now you're in a position where you might be able to attack with it again. If you're in a sacrifice deck and you can trigger it every turn, at some point this could grow to a fairly substantial size. And the other thing that I like about it is if your opponent goes to double block it, you can sack it as a combat trick to influence combat elsewhere. I think that there's going to be a lot of edges on this card. I think it works well in sacrifice. I think it works well in aggro. Later in the game, if you draw it, when drawing your 1-drop is typically pretty bad, you can, swing into your opponent before you play this, maybe trade a creature or 2 off in combat, get some damage in, and then play this post-combat, and it's just a 1-mana 2/2 menace, which is well worth 1 mana. So I think this is pretty good, in short.
And you think it's going to get that second +1/+1 counter often enough? Because I agree, that's all you need for this card to be good is to get that counter, but I've never tracked, descending before, so it's I'm trying to backlog, how often does that really happen before you get to your own end step? You think this is going to get up to a 2/2 often enough that it'll have that impact on the board?
Yeah, black creatures die. That's what they do.
Yeah.
So
they do die.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be that difficult to get this to a 2/2, and there are going to be games where you get it up to a 3/3. And once it's a 3/3, your opponent's going to have to start thinking about burning a removal spell in your 1-drop, which is always nice.
Yeah, this card's a 1-drop that doesn't take much for it to be good. Like I always say, I don't think it's going to be that hard to get 1 counter on this, and I think it's reasonable at some point to get 2 in some games. Also, notably, we're getting fetch lands, a half cycle of them, next month, I think, when they reprint cons. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, that'll be a little easier to do. I would expect that this is a card that also is going to just scale with the environment because it's a 1-drop, so it's automatically playable in basically any cube. I guess the more access to backlogs of cards you have, the more ways there are to combo with this. And Descent doesn't have to go from the graveyard or from the battlefield to the graveyard, so you can do stuff like land cyclers, faithless looting.
Blood token.
Blood token doesn't work, right? Because a token does not descend.
Well, you discard a card.
Oh, yeah, of course, right, yeah. Yeah, that works as well.
It has to be a permanent card.
Yeah.
It has to be a permanent card. I think one thing that really helps this card is that it doesn't have to be on board to see the permanent go to the graveyard. It just has to be there before you get to your end step, so you can trade off in combat and then play this post-combat and then go to end step and it'll get the second counter. So it should be pretty easy. It's not even one of those 1-drops I think that's super dirtily if you draw it late because you can set up that scenario. If you play it on turn 1, it's probably not getting the first counter until turn 3 or 4 at the earliest. But still, your 1-drop gets in some chip damage and stuff. So overall, there's a lot of moving parts here that I think add up to what is going to be a good card. Though I could see it falling flat in certain scenarios if your opponent's really savvy and just sorcery speed killing all your stuff to make sure Descend doesn't happen. It doesn't work with tokens, so you can't just Jadar Decayed Zombie every turn to Descend and stuff like that. So they made sure you couldn't just easily descend, off of tokens, treasures, stuff like that. But there are enough ways to do it, even outside of just trading off in combat, that this should grow pretty heavily.
Yeah. Black also has approximately 37 recursive threats, so
38 if you actually count.
Yeah, I must have missed one.
How long do you think till we get Stalagmite Stalker?
Oh man,
100% going to be a card. Real quick, I'm going to spend about 4 seconds on this card. There's a common in this set called Skull Cap Snail. It's 1 in a black for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent exiles a card from their hand. And we've seen this design a million times. It always ends up being one of Black's best commons in limited formats. But it's always discard instead of exile, and obviously they did that so that you're not putting permanents in your opponent's graveyard for Descend. But I do think this is starting to creep towards the power level of how good does this design need to be? How much do we need to push it before it's actually unrestricted playable? And honestly, if I opened an unrestricted pack and saw this card in it, I don't think I would sneeze at it too much because it's just a nice bread and butter card that can go in a lot of different black decks. But just wanted to touch on that one because They've power crept the Virus Beetle, the Burglar Rats, the Nizumi Informant, whatever you want to call it, and I think it's almost there. It just needs a combat keyword or something, and this will actually, I think, end up being an unrestricted playable card. It's just a speed bump 2-for-1 card that leaves behind a body for whatever decks need that.
Yeah, I actually suggested possibly testing this, just testing this in the unrestricted cube, and Chris threatened to pile driver me from the top rope. So
he's so aggressive, isn't he? Isn't he just really mean sometimes?
Isn't this basically in a lot of scenarios just Virus Beetle? Because they get to choose what card they're exiling from their hand.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
60% win rate Virus Beetle. Yes, it is.
I honestly think Virus Beetle as the reverse Spirited Companion is a card that would make decks in our environment. It's just when you start talking about, I'm not going to go down the cube equity rabbit hole on a set review here, there are other 2-drops that you're playing. So if you include a card like Skull Cap Snail, you're obviously excluding something else that you'd be playing instead, which is the type of thing that like leads me off of it. But I think if you made the decision to put Skull Cap Snail in like an unrestricted cube, I think it would perform as just a body that 2-for-1's your opponent. And we don't have effects like we have targeted discard. We don't really have the 2-for-1 eat some resources from your opponent's hand, add to the board type cards in this environment. And I'm not saying this card's there yet, but they just push the knob a little bit up, and I think it's like almost there. I think it is a keyword ability away from being an unrestricted playable card.
I think it we're very, very close.
Okay.
This effect is just much better than it looks in almost every case. There's almost always something to do with the 1/1 body. Even in our environment, there's stuff to do with it. And I think we're right on the cusp of this being playable, just because it's kind of the dorky mid-range glue card that taxes your opponent's curve.
Yeah, like I said, 4 seconds on Skullcap Snail. This next one is actually really interesting too, but just like a not for us card because of its mana value. We've got Blood Letter of Aclazotz, which is 1 black for a 2/4 mythic vampire demon with flying. If an opponent would lose life during your turn, they lose twice that much life instead. I really like this. This might be one of those adult gold dragon awards for just like imminently playable cube card with just a clean text box. Basically, all your creatures deal double damage to your opponent, and any effects that make your opponent lose life during your turn are doubled up. Obviously, 1 black is a little problematic as just kind of a general cube card.
I think that this is supposed to be a signpost for mono black aggro. Like, this is supposed to be your curve topper. I don't think it does as good of a job of being that heavily pipped aggro curve topper as like Torbran does, because Torbran just adds that damage from any source, like to any source.
On any turn too. This is only during your turn.
Yeah, I think if you're playing a mono black aggro deck in your cube, I think this could be a pretty good curve topper. If we're going to pay 3 black for this, one thing that I will say is I wish that they had phrased this. If an opponent would lose life from another source during your turn, they lose twice that much life, so they could have made this a 4/4 flyer for 4.
So that'd be good on your opponent's turn, like in combat on your opponent's turn too. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah, it would attack and block better.
Yeah, it would attack. It would just attack and block better. Exactly. Like, this is going to do 4 damage to your opponent's face if it connects, but sure, it's anemic for its cost. I think if we're going to pay 3 black for this, they could have said if an opponent would lose life from another source, they lose twice that much life instead, and just made this a 4/4. I mean, I love black aggro. Like, when I saw this card, I was like, probably not for us, but this is really sweet. And I think that if you're doing that kind of thing in your cube, like, maybe take a look at this.
Yeah, I think this card is cool for sure, but I just can't help but feel like, on average, it is worse for the decks that would play this card than Spawn of Mayhem or Rankle would be.
Probably, yeah.
Even like at comparable like black mana cost, because both of those cards are just really like I think Tim was just saying was flexible, right? They have a little bit of more play to them. This card does one thing and one thing only, and it does it well, but it really is just a very straightforward linear card.
I say when you're designing cards like this, like 4-drops that are that mana intensive, just like commit and make it black, so that if it does show up in a cube, like no one's going to try to put this in their like 9 swamp deck or something like that. But yeah, I think if this card costs 2 BB with like a different restriction, we would try it out. But 1 BBB is a little bit too narrow for us when our black 4-drops are a little bit more universally playable. Who wants to talk to me about this Preacher of the Schism card? I actually like the design on this quite a bit.
So, Preacher of the Schism is 2 and a black for a 2/4 vampire cleric with Death Touch. When it attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. When it attacks while you have the most life or are tied for the most life, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Like, this is just a solid black rock card. With 4 toughness, it's going to block a lot of things on defense. It has Death Touch, so it'll trade for anything. If your opponent has to double block, for some reason, like if they have like a 2/3 and a 2/3 or something, because this is a 2-power Death Toucher, it's going to kill both creatures. And when you attack with it, you're going to generate value. And if you like accelerate this out with like an elf on turn 2 and attack, like you're tied for the most life, it does both things. Again, like, it's not a thematic card. I just think that this is an excellent mid-range creature.
Yeah, you don't even care what you get when it attacks, right? You're not like, oh man, I really wish I had this or this. You're just like, I'm going to attack and get something. I'm either going to make a little piece of cardboard with lifelink, or I'm going to draw a card and lose life. I told you about this already, but I think the design of the card is just very clever too, because if you are at a lower life total, it makes a life linker, which creeps your life total back up. And if you're at a higher life total, it actually takes your life total down. And the sweet spot is being tied with your opponent's life total so that you get both modes on the attack, which is just really awesome.
If you're ahead, you're pressuring your own life total to give your opponent a chance to like kill you before the cards matter. But if you're behind, it generates things on board which encourage you to attack with it. There's a lot of clever designs going on here, and it's not overly complicated outside the pendulum effect of like getting both isn't extremely obvious at first. You have to think about it for a second. I'm actually surprised this is a 2/4. This in most sets I think would have been a 1/4, and that second point of power is a big deal here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool little card. But it's time for Bat God. We're gonna try.
All right, so folks at home, let's keep get out a tracker. I want you to keep track of how long it takes until Chris mentions this card not having a 5th point of toughness, and then track how many times he says it during his monologue. Go.
Oh my god. Okay, I'm gonna try to keep it to once. So it is 3 black for a 4/4 legendary creature Bat God with flying and lifelink. When it attacks, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, you draw a card. Whenever an opponent discards a land card, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. And when it dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control. So it turns into Temple of the Dead, which is a black mana source on a land. And it has 2 black and tap it, transform it back into the Bat God, activate only if a player has 1 or fewer cards in hand and only as a sorcery. So I will say this, I really wanted Mom Shieldred to be good, and she was clearly balanced for Commander. And I am looking for a mid-range, it doesn't have to be 5 cost, right? Like that's kind of arbitrary, but I'm looking for something in black that feels really worth 5 mana as like a powerful mid-range closer. That's just like a category of card that I'm looking for. The idea of something like that appeals to me. This is a 4/4 flyer for 5. It does have lifelink, but for heads up magic, it really could have used a 5th point of toughness. There it is, Toad.
Ding.
It could have done this on ETB, but I think what we're looking at here is because it hits each opponent, you know, the potentially drawing a card, the potential of making a bat token off of them choosing to discard a land card, whatever. The fact that in a multiplayer game that hits 3 people, I think this card is probably balanced around Commander. And I'm not going to go on like a monologue about this, but I will say that as a cube curator, it is a little annoying. I feel like when they print cards for Commander and standard sets, they're either like underpowered for heads-up magic because they are significantly more effective the more opponents you have, or they're just like wildly, outrageously overstated, like, what's the Phyrexian Angel thing that should have been printed as like a Commander deck commander, but instead got printed as standard? Yeah, like, so, I'm interested in this card. I want this card to be good. I want to test this card. I think we have room to try it. I think that this is going to suffer for being balanced for multiplayer. It's probably just not large enough.
I'm going to push back on that because I don't think that's why these gods, especially the green one, when we look at the green one, that one's just pushed on stats alone. But every single god feels like they're a point of toughness off from being like really good. And I think that's just good design because these die into lands. Like this card's okay in Commander. Like this isn't pushing Commander or anything. I think what they did is they took the text and like made it work in multiplayer. That's why you see each here, but that's just good design so that you're, you know, appealing to constructed and you also are making the card viable in Commander. But I think the impetus behind making all these gods 1 toughness lower is that you're getting a full entire extra land, like you're ramping when they die. So they wanted there to be a push and pull between here's this powerful card, but it's vulnerable. Right. But it's also vulnerable because you get something really good off of it when it dies. Plus these, I mean, I don't know how that often that's going to happen in Cube, but these lands can turn back into the god, which is kind of insane when that happens, right? Mm-hmm. And this one seems achievable, right? If either player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, like first off, you can facilitate yourself. Like these cards need to be vulnerable. Like they don't need to be 4/5s that like dodge all the removal, and then also they're going to come back later in the game. You want to make them killable. So I think like, I think this is good design that these cards weren't pushed like super high resilient threats, you know?
That's actually, those are all like really fair points. My one concern about the additional equity of this card turning into a land is because it's a 5-drop. It'll be interesting to see how often the one accelerated mana source when you're already on 5 actually benefits you.
Right, like Path to Exile gets way more palatable when you're killing your opponent while they already have 5 or 6 lands, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Tell, did you have anything to add to Aquazot's here?
It's okay. Like, I think it could end up being really good. It's the kind of card that'll be super obnoxious if you're trying to aggressively kill your opponent and they slam this and you can't immediately kill it, right? The lifelink will swing races really quickly. I think black can facilitate this one card in the hand better than I initially was thinking about it, because you're playing cards like Thoughtseize, you're playing cards like, you're either in an aggressive deck and this is your top end, or you're playing like a rock deck and this is your finisher. And both of those are decks that empty their hand out for different reasons, right? Rock is simplifying the game state, and the aggressive decks just dump out their hands because they're a bunch of 1 and 2 mana recursive threats.
Well, and an extra land gives you an extra mana source to dump your hand out quicker. So,
right.
You're not going to be stuck with cards in it. Like, I think this might actually be the easiest one to flip back. I know the blue one is just like tap this a bunch of times, but this one feels like you're actually going to do that. Like, it's going to die, and then the very next turn you're going to be able to transform it back.
Yeah, I mean, if you cheated a game state where your opponent's kind of out of resources, which is, again, what the Jundi sort of decks want to do, I mean, say you play this, they use their last removal spell to kill it, and then you untap and you flip this back and your opponent's back in the same bind. It's not hard to see this card being really powerful.
I hope it's good, because we've been scorned by the black 5-drop slot so many times between cards like Doom Whisperer and Junji. Like, it still blows my mind that Junji just didn't perform. Shieldred, you know. We played so many black 5-drop mid-rangey creatures, and, you know, this kind of falls right into territory. Also, worth noting, Aquazotz is like a total asshole in the lore for whatever reason. He's just like goes around being mean for no reason. But
is that why he's on an O'Hare or Ojer?
Yeah. O'Hare is a term of respect, and people do not respect Aquazotz. That's why he's the god that doesn't have that quality.
I didn't know if this was another like Valky Tybalt situation where Aquazotz was like, or Xenagos situation where the like usurper god type deal.
I don't know the exact lore. Actually, there's that blue black 8/8 in this set. It's
the one that you have to descend 8 or whatever.
Yeah, that's the original black god in the lore, and Aquazotz kind of usurped him. Also, Aquazotz is the only god in this set that has another creature type. It's a bat god. The other ones are just gods. We got a nice little removal spell to round out black here. Tel, why don't you talk to us about Bitter Triumph here?
Sure. So it's really, really simple one, just nice clean effect. Bitter Triumph is 1 in a black for a instant. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you discard a card or pay 3 life, and you destroy target creature or planeswalker. So, as someone in our Discord said, some people see Infernal Grasp 2.0. I just see Lightning Axe. But whether you're looking for a discard outlet, you know, just a tempo efficient spell, or you're playing it as a slightly worse Infernal Grasp that targets planeswalkers, this is just a powerful design. I think hitting planeswalkers is obviously great, and there's not too much to say here. It's just a good removal spell. There is a definite cost. The 3 life versus 2 is definitely a step up, but it's a very solid removal spell.
It's a Reanimator Enabler 2 for higher power environments. Like it's just straight up a discard outlet that kills creatures and planeswalkers.
Yeah, note that I guess the one notable thing here is, unlike a lot of recent designs, this is a cast trigger, right? So if you play this, you cast, you pay the life or discard it, and then they counterspell you. You do still pay the cost, as opposed to something like Infernal Grasp or Bitter Reunion type cards lately, where the discard is on the spell's resolution.
Though that also means you can copy the spell and not have to pay the cost again.
It does.
Which isn't something that comes up in our cube. Yeah, we talked about this one a little bit either yesterday or day before, and how obviously you would just play 1 in a black, pay 3 life, kill a creature at instant speed. But when you add that to a cube that also has Infernal Grasp, Thoughtseize, Murderous Rider, stuff like that, you have to kind of step back and be like, how much damage can I actually deal to myself? Because then you're getting in situations where your control deck is looking for Doom Blades, and all they're seeing are the Infernal Grasps and Bitter Triumphs and stuff like that. And it's like, well, I'm going to take 8 damage off my own spells in the course of this game. So there's a little bit of tension there, but not enough for us to not play this card. It's just super versatile. Red, do you guys want to gripe about red for a second? Actually, red's pretty quick. It's just 4 creatures, 3 of which we think are like Well, 2 of which we think are overpowered, and then like maybe one really cool one.
Yeah, this is just, I don't know what they were thinking with some of the red cards in this set. This is...
Yeah, these first 2 are just kind of nonsense cards. The first one is a Bonehorde Dracosaur, which is 3 red for a 5/5 mythic dinosaur dragon. Got to get your dragon in each set, Magic. Got to get your dragon in there, Wizards.
Got to cost 5 too.
It's got to cost 5. It has to be 3 red. 5 mana, 5/5 flying, first strike. I could stop there, and that's like almost on the cusp of playable. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. If you exiled a land, make a 3/1 dinosaur. If you exiled a non-land, make a treasure token. So 5 mana, 5/5, first strike flying, draw 2 cards every turn, and possibly make a treasure and a 3/1 every turn on upkeep. Like, you guys have been talking about the Mole Slayers. You know, every Bane Slayer is also a Mole Slayer. It doesn't give you that immediate ETB value, but if it lasts any more than 0 turns, like, you're just getting insane value off this card. Like, straight up probably 4 for 1 on your first upkeep if you're able to play both cards. And then if it survives an additional turn, like, I don't understand how you can lose a game from that position.
I think, Tim, you the other day said something that has been kind of my thought on cards like this, which is, you know, there's Dies to Doomblade, which is not an argument for a card. And then there's Must Die to Doomblade, which is a very good argument for a card. This card just, if you play it, your opponent kills it or you win the game. There's almost no way to lose after...
There's no middle ground.
After you've untapped, impulse drawn 2, and probably gotten, you know, a dinosaur, a land, a treasure, and a spell, which is like the average hit on this. How do you lose? How do you lose? You've got a 5/5 flying first strike. Your opponent can't attack into you unless they're massively ahead on board. Almost no creature single-handedly takes this on in combat that isn't Grave Titan or something like that. This is just a silly card. And it's also binary. It's not fun. There's no interesting decision-making. It's just a sledgehammer in search of a nail.
Yeah, Andy Mangold was talking about this on Lucky Paper Radio, and he really doesn't play like high-cost Baneslayers. And he was talking about how, like, high-cost Baneslayers aren't even necessarily bad cards, right? Part of the reason that he's not interested in playing them is, like, Baneslayers do win games, and they tend to just win games where your opponent does not have a removal spell for them. And that creates this really swingy gameplay where it's like, do you have it or not? And whether you have it or not is what the game boils down to. Well, it used to be that, like, Baneslayers looked like Baneslayer Angel. I mean... Don't get me wrong, if Baneslayer gets to swing a couple times, the game is probably over, right? But this produces material and card advantage and bricks the board. I mean, I'm not saying anything you guys haven't said already. Like, this card boils the entire game down to, like, what is currently in your opponent's hand.
Why do we need 4? Why do we need to make 4 cards for 1 as an upkeep trigger? That's just the first turn.
I think Chris just said it right. This is less about what the card does and more about what your opponent can do about it. Would the card be reasonable if it exiled 1 card instead of 2? It would be more reasonable, but would it be, like, keep everything else the same, it hits 1 card each turn, and you get whichever bonus is associated with that card. You can play that card till end of turn.
I think the first strike is pretty egregious on it, too.
Yeah, that
first strike is so weird, too, on a big flyer. It's because the first strike is added there only for the purposes of your opponent not being able to attack you the turn it comes down, which is one of the avenues for beating cards like this, is just to jam into your opponent, you know? So it's so weird that first strike is here because it seems like such an intentional thing added to the card for that purpose, and the card doesn't need that, you know?
Also, there's, like, and this is more of a flavor thing, like with Baneslayer Angel, I can understand why it has first strike, right? It's like a supernatural being with, you know, angelic swiftness or whatever. I can conceive that. It's like an expert swordsman or something. But why does the big Tyrannosaurus Rex dinosaur have first strike?
Because it's a dinosaur dragon, because it's cool-tailed.
Yeah, just, I don't know. I don't really like designs like this. I'm actually not opposed to creatures that are explicitly just good in combat, but in Modern Magic, those look like 3 and 4 drops, not 5 drops. I think the Impulse Draw 1 would be a lot more fair, I will say, but First Strike is still pretty unreasonable. I think First Strike as a mechanic is one that perhaps a bit much to say this, but I kind of wish they would just get rid of it in the way that it currently works. So Legends of Runeterra, the way First Strike works in that game is it only works when you're attacking. And I think that's a lot more reasonable because then it makes it about being able to push your advantage and press your attacks as opposed to just being a ridiculous blocker as well.
Yeah, this card should get rid of First Strike and literally have a line of text that says it can't block at all. Like, give it a drawback. Like, Stop making cards like this. They're not fun to play. Baneslayer does beat this in combat though, so
yeah. Probably the best card in the set coming up next. This card is ridiculous.
Okay. So from one, like, out of the frying pan into the fire, is that the phrase? Breach's Eager Pillager is 2 and a red for a 3/3 rare legendary goblin pirate with first strike. Gotta have first strike. Whenever a pirate you control attacks, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Create a treasure token. Target creature can't block this turn. Exile top card of your library. You may play it this turn. So that triggers whenever a pirate attacks, which means it triggers when Breaches attacks, but also if you happen to have other pirates, like we've actually got a few with Kari Zev and the new Malcolm and the Larcenist. If those attack in the same combat step, you get to pick another mode. So potentially all three. 90% of the time, you're just going to get one of these modes, but you get to choose which one, and this is a 3-mana 3/3 first striker. Again, same problem where it's a super aggressive card that just gets to play defense the turn it comes down to. And why do you have to brick wall combat on the turn before your big like trigger too? It's like there needs to be some push and pull for these cards, and this one just doesn't have it. It's just all upside.
Yeah, this card being a 3/3 is also obviously pushed for constructed, but it's pretty egregious. If it was a 3/2, the number of cards that it dies to goes up pretty substantially. All the shock variants, cut down, things like that now kill it. I don't understand why this needed to have first strike instead of menace, for example, or first strike when it attacks. I think both of those would have been better. It could have done without one of the 3 lines of text on it, and it still would have been a fantastic card. This is just one of those ones where it feels like all the knobs were just kind of turned to 10. It's not the same, but it reminds me a lot of Adeline's design, where like, but wait, there's more. You know, it's like just does so many things so well.
I mean, Adeline is a sledgehammer design, but the fact that she at least interacts with what else is going on the board in terms of her size, whether or not she produces a creature the turn she comes down, that sort of thing. That's one thing. But Tel, you and I were talking about this. Tim, maybe you and I were talking about this too. But like, we've actually cut some cards from the cube where if you're drafting a synergy deck and you see card X in the same pack as a good intentional synergy card for your deck, and you feel like you're supposed to take it, then that doesn't promote interesting draft decisions. And a 3/3 body with first strike that generates value every time it attacks and blocks extremely well is just like, what doesn't this do? And like, furthermore, first strike is especially obnoxious in red, because now whenever you're lining up blocks, you have to ask yourself the question, is there a burn spell coming down that's going to blow me out?
Yeah, this attacks into your 5/5. What are you doing? Blocking?
Yeah, I mean, they could literally just have shock.
Also, you're not blocking because they can take your blocker out of commission on attacks. Like,
yeah, it creates so many lose scenarios. I think this card, if you're playing in like the really, really powerful environments, after maybe Lelia and Fable the Mirror Breaker, this has to just be the best red 3-drop, right?
I mean, in order for you to block this, you need multiple 4+ toughness creatures on board.
Yeah.
Which is nonsense. You know how you fix this card? You just, instead of choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn, just choose one that hasn't been chosen. Let Breaches get all 3 modes over the course of multiple attacks, and then that's it. You get one shot at each mode, and it's still a very good card.
Yeah.
But yeah, the fact that the upside on this, like, I have to imagine, I don't know if Pirates is going to be standard viable, but you go 1-drop Pirate, 2-drop Pirate, play this on turn 3 and get 2 of these triggers right away.
I mean, I just assume we're putting this in our mono red deck and it's just going to be nuts, right? Like,
all right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the other 2 cards, which I think are ultimately more fair and interesting. Only 4 creatures in red to talk about. No burn spells, interestingly, to talk about this time around. But the next card up is Trumpeting I guess this is a burn spell. Trumpeting Carnosaur is 4 red for a rare 7/6 dinosaur. Not a dinosaur dragon. Not very cool. It has trample. When it enters the battlefield, discover 5, and it has 2 in a red, discard it from your hand to deal 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker. So you guys can talk more about it, but we're not going to play this because we prefer Inferno Titan in this slot. But this is like the most cubable card as far as a top-end card that ever cubed, right? Like just a big kind of splashy 6-drop that you can double up as a removal spell if you need to. It basically has like Channel as a removal spell, which is good. Like, this card is good, but we're going to preference towards, Inferno Titan.
Lets you set up your reanimation effects as well while using it
Yeah.
as a removal spell. The thing that this goes back to what we were talking about with Discover at the beginning of the episode, where this card is going to be. There's going to be times where this card flips over, a 5-drop like Nissa, or it's going to flip over a Chandra or something like that. It's going to be completely broken. And then there's going to be times where this flips over a Llanowar Elves or a Utopia Sprawl or whatever, some 1-drop, and it's going to feel really bad. And I just don't like designs like this. I mentioned possibly testing it over Inferno Titan, but we were all three of us were of the opinion Inferno Titan is just a more interesting card because you can plan your game plan around the reliability of what that effect is going to do, that deal 3.
This card is probably, it might be better than Inferno Titan in higher power environments that have, like Teld mentioned, that have Reanimator, have Sneak Attack, things like that. I think that this has some edges in like different environments, but like for us, I think we all think that Inferno Titan is more interesting, and we literally just got it too, so it's not like Inferno Titan is like old hat and we're looking to replace it.
Yeah, it's not like it's a card that's been around for 2 years or anything. I do think the last card's really cool, though.
Yeah, I before we get at that one, I did want to note, it's really interesting to Discover as an ETB instead of Cascade as a cast trigger, because you can do things like cast this, flip into a Boink spell, or a clone creature, have it come in as a copy of it, blink it. That's the sort of like kind of broken strategy that makes me wonder why they decided we needed another Cascade mechanic in the first place, because it just leads to these really broken situations. But Cascade as an ETB, like, someone's going to break that. that could be problematic. But anyway, yeah. Chris, why don't you talk to me about this next one, because it has a word I can't pronounce in its name.
This is Inti, Seneschal of the Sun.
He did it.
It is 1 and a red for a 2/2 human knight. Whenever you attack, you may discard a card. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains trample until end of turn. When you discard 1 or more cards, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until your next end step. So we've literally just recently been talking about how it feels like red in our cube as an aggressive color could use a few more ways to filter the hand and see some more cards. And this provides exactly that. You can rummage things away. Now, you won't always get the value of the impulse draw, and you might top something you can't afford to play yet, but in a really low curving aggro deck, you probably will be able to afford whatever you hit. I think this is just a really good card. Unlike the other red designs, all of which are just like stat piles, Inti is interesting. Like in red, if you're playing it in a red-black aggro deck, you can like discard your like Bloodghasts and things of the world to just like literally generate card advantage. It's just a rummaging effect that gives you a permanent bonus. So like if you want to roll the dice on the draw, like you're attacking with this as a 3/3 on turn 3. I think this is just like a solid all-rounder. I like it.
Yeah, it's open-ended too. The attack trigger doesn't have to be this attack, and so you could technically go 1-drop into this on turn 2, attack with your 1-drop, get a counter on it. Pretty good, and rummage while you're at it. You're never down cards. Plus, the discard ability is a separate clause. It's not even tied to the attack trigger. So if you play like your Faithless Looting, you actually trigger this twice, and you get to impulse draw 2 cards for the end of turn. So it works with anything else that just is a generic discard effect, which I think is really cool design and cool move there. Not quite as consistent with pumping up the power as like Luminarch Aspirant. Like something has to get into combat for that to trigger. You don't get to just passively sit there and get the counters. But yeah, as far as 2-drops go, very high upside, card advantage plus extra power on board, but you actually have to do a little bit of work for it. So it is a lot more interesting of a card.
And notably, we do have like 5 looters now in blue-red, or excuse me, in blue. So your blue-red deck can use this to generate some extra value. Could be cool. Putting counters on flyers, also better than putting them on anything else. So putting this on a Malcolm, making it a 3/2 is a real upshift in terms of how quickly that card kills you.
Yeah, so super cool. Oh yeah, I guess it's really cool with Malcolm because you get to discard twice, right? You get to do the double +1. Yeah, it's still attacking when it connects in combat, so you could get another +1 counter. Super cool card, just solid little 2-drop. Does move us into green, where we get to talk about a bunch of merfolk and then another god we're not going to play. I do want Chris to take this next one because you guys had a little bit of contention between whether this card is even cubable or not, and I kind of fall firmly in the middle of like I'm fine testing the card but don't really know how it's going to play out.
Yeah, Jade-Legged Spelunker is X and a green for a 1/1, and when it ETBs, it explores X times. So the way that I think about this is a Jade Light Ranger that's easier to cast and has 1 less base power, and in exchange for that, it can just scale up. That's the way that I look at it. Now, that being said, when the card that, or the next piece of action that you don't want to flip over because you don't know if you're going to hit another piece of action that is as good, like it's just a Hydra. So I don't know. I honestly don't know. What I'm thinking, and the reason that I kind of want to test it, is that in a really dedicated ramp deck where your deck is basically all accelerants, cantrips, and giant threats, you're just going to draw every land and bin every dork that you see when you have enough mana until you find your next thing to cast. And I think that could be pretty powerful. And sometimes you're just going to like cast it on 3 and it's just like going to draw 2. It's just going to be like a 1/1 that drew 2 lands, which is not like an exciting deal, but it's not terrible. Maybe this is just not that good at like any point. Like maybe it's just not quite there. I don't know.
I'm of the opinion that it's got the Hydro Crisis problem, that I don't think this card is going to be... I don't think you're going to be happy to play this card at really any point until you have a ridiculous amount of mana to be able to essentially dig through your entire deck and find exactly what you're looking for and also make a giant creature. I could see it playing out better than that. I'm not like a total downer. I'm down to test it and try it out, but I think most of the time this is just going to be worse than Jade Light Ranger, and we don't play that card.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like it's worse than Merfolk Branchwalker on 2. It's worse than Jade Light Ranger on 3, just necessarily. But it is a 1-drop. I don't know. You'd never play this on 1, but it's a 1-drop if you need it to be. It's a 5-drop if you need it to be. My kind of concern with it is the situations where you play it on 5, right? X is 4, and you immediately reveal a card that you don't want to bin because you want to draw it next turn, which means you're going to have a good draw step, which is something. You know, the information is worth something. But then you just played 5 mana for like 4/4? 5/5, yeah. Which is okay. Like, you can't Colossopede in this format in unrestricted cube and be that happy about it. But also, if it just draws you a bunch of lands, you got all this material, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, my game plan with the sort of decks that Chris is describing with this card is going to be to use cantrips and early dorks to use the cantrips to sculpt my hand, and then I'm going to turn the corner on the turns that this would actually be good. So again, I hope it plays out well because this card was really cool. When I saw it, I was kind of excited about it. I'm just not convinced that this is ever going to be something we're happy to cast at really any mana value.
We shall find out. The next one here, Sentinel of the Nameless City, a lot less to talk about here. This card is just, blatantly good on power level. 2 and a green for a 3/4 rare Merfolk Warrior Scout with Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, create a map token. That's it. Like, just a stat beast, good stats, aggressive body, not hard to cast, value when it enters the battlefield and leaves. And we said a map token isn't as good as a clue token or a treasure or whatever, but it's still something. And, whether you're using that to explore with this creature or something else, you are growing your board or drawing extra land. So kind of annoying design in my estimation because there's nothing interesting going on with it at all. But it's just very good.
This card will be super obnoxious to deal with from the aggro perspective too. It's going to be beating you down while getting bigger, while also blocking on your turn. It's going to be really annoying, but good card. Just like you said, super boring design, very good on rate.
Yep. Watley is back, desparked here. Watley, Poet of Unity, is 2 and a green for a 2/3 mythic legendary human warrior bard. When Watley enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land, put it in your hand and shuffle. You may pay 3 and 2 additional mana, combination of red and white. So 5 mana total. Exile it, return them to the battlefield as a saga. Chapter 1 makes 2 3/3 dinosaurs. Chapter 2 lets all your creatures tap for red, green, or white. Chapter 3 lets you search up a dinosaur, which does nothing in a lot of cases. Chapter 4 gives all of your dinosaurs double strike and trample. So Teld was of the opinion that just kind of Watley on its own as a 3 mana 2/3 that searches up a land and probably transforms at some point in the game into like 2/3/3s is worth it. Chris, I think, was a lot less excited about just the front half of the card in general, assuming that first half of the card is not really worth a cube slot on its own.
Yeah, I think this card is a Civic Wayfinder with a better body, and like in the mid to late game, you're going to be able to get a little bit extra value out of it if you're not drawing into something to cast. I think I'm also a little bit partial to this because I almost always tend to draft green as like some sort of Naya deck, and I tend to draft my green ramp decks as like green white or green red, which is a little different than how most people draft them in this cube. But basically, if I'm playing green, I probably am playing some number of red or white sources in my deck, just by nature of the way I draft. I don't think it's amazing, but I think it's fine in that sort of stabilizer, consistency booster type of role, which I tend to value very highly in the green ramp decks.
This is not at all a knock on the power level of the card, but playing this in our green 3-drop section with hybrid mana symbols on it would just annoy the bejesus out of me, and I don't think that we'd really be missing out on anything interesting if we didn't play it. So, like, I'm not saying that I don't think that this card is, like, solid value. I will say that I don't think Chapter 2 on the Saga really does anything either. Like, once you're on 5 or 6 lands, maybe it enables some kind of explosive double spell, but, like...
You can boil the entire Saga down to make 2 3/3s, right? Even the last chapter, the double strike and trample mode doesn't matter because you're either winning by that point or your opponent just picks off the dinosaurs. But this is a 3-mana 2/3 that picks up a land. You pay 5 mana to basically put a +1 counter and make another 3/3, right? Because Huatli has to exile. Like, Huatli doesn't get to sit on board with the dinosaur, so...
Yeah, I do agree we're not really missing a lot if we don't run this. Like, I just, this is a kind of effect that I am partial to.
I have that same issue with the hybrid mana symbols here, But yeah, I think this is like squarely in the middle enough that we probably don't need to play this card. And it is unfortunate that if we did play it, like, a lot of the dinosaur text is just kind of lost on us,
Yeah, that's another element of it for me. I don't think the fact that, like, there's dinosaur text on it that's not, like, relevant in our cube, like, makes it not a good card. You remember my whole thing with, like, Soul Seer and that, like, affinity for artifacts, or if you like a control and equipment, it's 1 cheaper card.
Yeah.
Like, the one that is 1 cheaper, if you have an equipment, Rebel Salvo is strictly better, but I don't like text that indicates that something should be potentially relevant in your environment that's not. That's just like a mental cleanliness thing for me. Like, I'm not advocating that anybody change their philosophy on that or do it any differently if that's the way that they like to do it. But I consider this kind of stuff additive distraction, and I'm just not into it.
A very basic effect here that we're adding to our card pool. The next card is Glimpse the Core. 1 and a green for an uncommon sorcery. Choose one, search your library for a basic forest card, put it on the battlefield. Tapped, then shuffle, and then obviously nonsense text about returning a cave from your graveyard to the battlefield tap. But 1 in a green, go get a forest, a basic forest, put it into play. Rampant Growth. Very as restricted as you can get, right? Comes in tapped, has to be basic, has to be forest. But this is a new effect for us, or at least it's the first traditional Rampant Growth effect that we have in the card pool, and I think that makes it kind of a auto-include.
Yeah, ramp that can't be interacted with is good.
Yeah, we have what's that one called? Emergence Sequence, but that turns the land that you get into a creature, which makes it vulnerable to removal, and you would prefer most of your ramp effects to just, give you the land permanently and know that you're going to untap with that land, which Emergence Sequence doesn't do.
That's basically it. If you have access to Rampant Growth, this is not, but for us, it's new.
3 Visits, Nature's Lore, like Farseek, Soccer Tri-Builder. There's a ton of better versions of this card, but for our card pool, it's very new. Let's wrap up green with a traditional, we're not going to play this card because it's too powerful. Oher Kazlim, Deepest Growth, 3 green for a 6/5 mythic rare god with trample. When it deals combat damage to a player, reveal that many cards from the top of your library. You may put a creature card and or I missed that, and or a land card from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom. Huh. Yeah, apparently you get both. What the heck? Onto the battlefield, by the way. Put the rest on the bottom random order. When it dies, it transforms into Temple of Cultivation, which is a land that taps for green mana. You can pay 2 and a green to transform it back into the god. Activate only if you control 10 or more permanents, and only as a sorcery. So there's a nod to Ascend from Rivals of Ixalan, which is just not even hard to do. You're going to have 10 permanents on board. 5 mana, 6/5 trample, hits your opponent, put a creature in land on the battlefield, and you get to look at 6 cards unless they threw some chump blockers in front of it. Even if they throw a 3/3 and a 2/2 in front of this, just to get it off the board, you still trample over for 1 and look at 1 card. I didn't realize this let you put both into play too, and there's no stipulation on the creature you put into play. It's not like put a creature with mana value less than the amount of damage you dealt or something. Nope, just pick a creature and put it on the battlefield. This card's messed up.
Yeah, this card's very silly.
It's that stipulation on transforming it back into the god is basically nothing by the time you get to the point where you can activate that ability.
I think this is really honing in on the sort of gameplay issue that Baneslayers are putting on the game. And like, I don't have a problem. Like I said, I don't have a problem with combat-based creatures. I actually am really fond of them. But these 5 and 6 mana Baneslayer-y type cards, just the way we've pushed removal, they have to, by their very nature, kind of create binary game states. And that's just not fun. It's not fun for either player. Like, and maybe it's fun to like slam something into play the first time you do this, but it's not interesting design to be like, all right, I'm gonna play my giant thing. Do you have the removal spell? If not, I probably win.
Yeah, I hit you for 4, and I put Titan of Industry and a land into play for free.
It's a shame. The art's incredibly cool. I think for like a lot of cubes that are doing really, really busted stuff, so like the fair green creatures like have to be insane to be worth playing. I think that this is a very powerful green 5-drop in a series of powerful green 5-drops that have just been like incoming nonstop. For us, we've kind of had to make a choice to deliberately cut back on green cards that just are giant and create free card advantage. And also we've had to make a choice between really cutting out the 1-mana ramp so these things don't come down as fast, or reducing the top end quality of like the 5 and 6 drops. And green is about ramping fast. People enjoy playing fast ramp. That's what green does. So what we've elected to do is to avoid playing super overtuned card advantage engines in green like this.
Yeah, I think Battle Mammoth is fine. Like, we don't need Battle Mammoth to start flipping Titan of Industries into play.
No. And turning into a land when it dies, which is actually relevant in green.
That draws you a 6/5 trample later in the game.
Yeah, the problem with any green creature too, and I think this is something that if you haven't been doing it, you probably need to, is any green 5-drop, you really should look at, and I know this isn't reasonable, but like, probably look at it more like a 3 or a 4 mana, or turn 3 or turn 4 play, because that's what they're going to do. And so if a card you're like, well, on turn 5, this isn't very good, well, how was it on turn 3?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I love these big splashy gods. I think they make new sets exciting and stuff. But one problem whenever we get cycles like this, or the Scarab God is there and stuff like that, is it really puts pressure on your removal to exile. But then we've noticed a problem with, we have too much exile effects that field out a lot of other death triggers and stuff. So minor gripe there, because I don't think we're going to play this card at the time being. It's just not healthy for our environment, but. Yeah, super powerful. We actually talked about 3 of the gods here, which is way more than I thought we were going to do when the red one was revealed, and didn't seem that good. But let's go ahead and move into gold. I'm just going to start off with this first one. Bartolome del Presidio. Del Presidio. White-black for a 2/1 legendary uncommon vampire knight. Sacrifice another creature or artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Bartolomeo. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but because I don't know if we play this card or not, but it is a free, unconditional instant speed sack outlet that grows the creature and also lets you sacrifice artifacts. And when they revealed this card, I think it was Blake Rasmussen on whatever the daily Magic Twitch thing is. He said that we're going to start easing the restrictions on sack outlets moving forward for a little bit, because people are like, isn't this just like the best sack outlet on Arena? And yeah, free sack outlet, instant speed. We don't get a lot of those, and most of them are rare. This one's actually just an uncommon. So this is one of those cards that I'm not advocating for like, hey, play this card. It's super bust or anything, but it is one of those like signs of what's to come type cards, and hopefully a good sign that we get more pushed sack outlets in the future.
I personally, and I think Tell agrees, that Ellis is probably like a stronger overall card for the Orzhov section for a variety of reasons, but yeah, this is totally playable.
You could take stock of, do I want another enabler or do I want another payoff, and then switch things around.
The other thing is you really only need one sack outlet and you're good, right? And even then you can do without. The thing about it, and I've seen people push back on this a little bit, is I'm of the opinion there's no such thing as too many blood artists, because each blood artist makes every other blood artist better by being another blood artist on the stack. And so eventually you get to a point where if you've got 3 or 4 blood artists in play, just killing a blood artist in and of itself hits you for like 4. Whereas multiple sack outlets typically compete with one another instead of enhancing one another. So it's kind of just how much, the push and pull of like enablers or whatever, but the enablers are way, way better than I guess the payoffs in this case are way, way better than the enablers. I don't know. Anyways, point is, you can play 10 blood artists in your deck and you've probably got a good deck. You cannot play 10 sack outlets in your deck and have a good deck.
That's true.
I didn't actually get a chance to talk to you guys about this next card. Were either of you into Anim Pakal, the 1000th Moon?
It's okay.
1 red white for a 1/2 legendary creature human soldier at rare. Whenever you attack with one or more non-gnome creatures, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Then create X 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on a Nympha call. It's an interesting card. It's kind of like a weird Rabblemaster variant that does not need to attack itself to grow. I think it's kind of a cool Rabblemaster design. I think from a power level perspective, the problem is that, like, it's not obvious to me that this is better than other Rabblemaster variants, and it's a 3-drop in Boros.
Yeah, people were comparing it to a Krenko Tin Street Kingpin. Whatever that card's called. Which notably, Krenko has to attack, but Krenko also counts its total power, not just the number of +1/+1 counters, whereas this one is limited to just the +1 counters on it, but doesn't actually have to engage in combat itself.
I think the other thing is right now the 3 Boros cards we are running, which is Lightning Helix, Showdown of the Skalds, and Quintorius Loremaster, are all very flexible cards in that you can kind of play them in your aggressive decks and they'll be good, but Boros aggro isn't a very consistent deck. And so having your Boros cards fit into other decks where they can still be good or be very easy to fit into your mana base with just a relatively easy splash, I think goes a long way. Whereas I think this card really wants to be in a dedicated Boros deck where you're casting it on turn 3 and shipping with a 2-drop. So I'm just not really on board with the way this is going to play out, given Boros, I think, works best as, if you're playing raw Boros at our cube, I think it actually just plays out as a mid-range deck better than a traditional aggro deck.
I do like the design of it. I like that it facilitates kind of a tokens strategy, which is where I'm hoping that they take Boros a little bit more in the future. I think that if you're playing like a creature-heavy, combat-oriented cube, either in like the modern card pool or in our card pool, certainly, I think that this card is probably good enough. I think the question is, like, do you have space for it? Like, how many white 3-drops are you running that are just rock solid? How many red 3-drops are you running that are just rock solid? Does your Boros Gold section really need a 3-drop creature? For us, the answer is no. But if you're interested in this design, I don't think it's a bad card. I think that this is like a solid little card. But as Teld mentioned, like, this really demands to be curved into.
Teld, you added Saheeli to this list. Do you want to talk about the card real quick?
Yeah, so the Saheeli in the set is Saheeli, the Sun's Brilliance. It's a 2/2 for blue-red. It's a legendary human artificer and has blue-red tap. Create a token that's a copy of another target creature or artifact you control, except that it's an artifact. In addition to its other types, it gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Just a cool, sweet little value card. If you're doing anything with artifacts, obviously, this can create artifacts and then sack them. There's a lot of cards that care about artifacts entering and leaving play. It's kind of got like a fair, fixed Splinter 20 vibe where you're using it more to generate incidental value off of attack triggers or ETB triggers. And it's super cheap and not that expensive to activate. Can be done at not sorcery speed as well. So this just has like a lot of little nice tunings going on that I think makes it a really cool card. I don't think it's for our cube at all, but there are a lot of cubes that I think would really like this one, and not just cards that are not just cubes that care about artifacts, though I do think it would be very good in something like your Affinity Cube, for example.
Yeah, these effects are normally a little more restrictive, right? They only target artifacts and turn them into creatures or something like that. But this can just copy a creature you control until end of turn, which is usually pretty valuable. Actually interesting. Because it's not sorcery speed, you can also do the Fable trick, right? Where you do this during the end step and then you untap and you can make another token during your turn to ship with both, potentially. Mm-hmm. One to mention a removal spell that we're getting in this set called Molten Collapse. It's black-red for a rare sorcery. Choose one. If you descended this turn, you may choose both instead. The modes are destroy target creature or planeswalker, and or destroy target non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Only reason I mention this here is not because we care too much for our cube, because there just really aren't non-creature, non-land permanents that cost 1 that we're really vying to shut down or anything like that. But Dreadbore is just a perfectly playable cube card. Dreadbore is black-red sorcery, destroy target creature or planeswalker, so this is just a strictly better version of Dreadbore, which is not a card we have in our card pool and probably wouldn't use a gold slot on anyway. But if you're the type of person who's cubing with Dreadbore, well, here you go. You have a strictly better version that also gives you an incidental out to some problematic cards or some really resilient one-drop cards that can fuel strategies. And so one of you guys listed a couple of them here, like the Colossus Hammer, Ozolith, Hardened Scales, amulets, a bunch of constructed cards that can be blown up with the second mode here. So this probably has a lot of constructed implications, but as far as strictly better Dreadbore, decent little card. You guys had a conversation about this little gremlin looking fellow here.
He is a goblin warlock, thank you.
Hey, he looks gremlin-y. He's a Zoyawa Lava Tongue, black-red for a 2/2, uncommon, legendary Goblin Warlock, as Tel pointed out. Has Death Touch at the beginning of your end step. If you descended this turn, each opponent may discard a card or sacrifice a permanent. Zoyawa deals 3 damage to each opponent who didn't. So you guys had a little bit of a conversation on this one. Go ahead and fill me in. It seemed like you both liked it quite a bit.
Yeah, this card's sweet. It's a 2-mana Death Toucher, 2/2. So it attacks, it blocks. That's all you can really ask of your 2-drop once you get some extra effect out of it. So good in combat, both early and late. And then I don't think it's going to be all that hard in red-black to start getting cards into the graveyard for Descended and putting pressure on your opponent. Like, obviously, if you think about this late game, it's not as good because your opponent can sack lands and be fine. But in the earlier portions of the game, especially if you're trading off these recursive creatures that we keep referencing in black, and black-red is more likely than other decks to want to throw cards at your face if they're in an aggressive deck, this card starts asking your opponent very real questions of, like, how much life is it worth to give up before they start losing card advantage? And then if even in like a rock deck, this is just a fine blocker that occasionally gets you some incidental value with something like Kroxa. There's a few ways to trigger it, and it just blocks and attacks reasonably well.
It's amazing with Kroxa.
Yeah.
It does all the things with Kroxa.
Right. So just kind of a really good package for 2 mana is what I'm thinking.
I think it's totally testable. I overlooked it. Part of the reason that I'm interested in testing this is we recently got some pieces for and made some changes to make red a more attractive secondary color for a sacrifice deck, including Goblin Bombardment. I think that this does a reasonably good job of signaling it. It's like an interesting take on a Blood to Artist style effect. And I love Judith a lot, but recently it's just kind of felt like there's enough stuff going on at that CMC between black and red that, like, she just feels like, oh, I've just got to cut another 3-drop to fit this in here, right? And I think Judith is really powerful when you curve into it. I think that Judith is excellent for the style of deck. It's just starting to feel like the 3-drop slot is a little crowded for those style of decks in our cube, especially with like Lurrus floating around that will totally show up in black-red decks.
Notably, this is good with Lurrus.
Yeah, I mean, everything's good with Lurrus, right? Yeah, I think the Death Touch on it is pretty damn relevant, too, because, like, later in the game, it just, like, trades for anything. It attacks into green creatures really well. I'm not sold that this is going to be excellent, because, to Teld's point, like, later in the game, the fact that you don't have agency over what they sacrifice, like, if it's later in the game, it's like, okay, I mean, I guess I'll sacrifice, like, my 7th land drop or whatever. That's not nearly as good, but, like, bolting your opponent's face, if they don't want to discard a card or sacrifice a permanent, is like significant damage for a 2-mana investment. So I think we just kind of want to see what it does.
Similar to the Stalactite Crawler, were you thinking like you get 1 trigger out of this, your opponent takes 3 early, and it's like, boom, my 2-drop did what it needed to do, right? Anything from there is upside.
I mean, a 2/2 Death Toucher that flame spiked or lava spiked our opponent on ETB would be an insane card, right?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, I guess you need to get 1 hit on your opponent with the damage trigger early on, and that's probably enough. Anything after that is just bonus.
I think this card also, the biggest thing is that Judith is really good when you're ahead, and you can slam Judith and start just going to town. But I think this card is a lot better when you're in a back foot defensive position, because your opponent is going to be a little more reluctant to attack into it with their valuable creatures.
Judith can do that too, like, right, because it can distribute damage, and it, like, gives all of your creatures +1/+0, so they're harder to attack into profitably. But I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I didn't really give this card much thought either, but yeah, let's try it out. Let's see how it does. That leads us into our last gold card here, which is Quintorius Cond, I don't know. Quintorius is back. Planeswalker sparked. Everybody else lost their spark, and Quintorius is just chilling. 3 red-white for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker, mythic rare. Has a static ability. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, Quintorius deals 2 damage to each opponent, and you gain 2 life, and every red card does that, so should be triggering fairly frequently. +1, make a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. -3 is just discover 4, and -6 don't really care, but exile any number of cards from your graveyard, add red for each card exiled this way, and you may play those cards this turn. So 5 mana, 4 loyalty walker that pluses to make 3/2s and -3s to discover 4, and gets you some incidental like mini lightning helixes against your opponent whenever you cast cards from exile, which obviously -3 does as well. There's a note here underneath it that says Quintorius Lore Master at home, and that might just be a nice little bow to put on the card. Quintorius Lore Master is the one from Mom, and I think has been performing way above expectations in our cube, so it's kind of hard to justify this Quintorius when that one's doing so well.
Yeah, I always like to shout out Quintorius Lore Master's praises, because during set review, I was not exactly confident that that card was going to be any good, and I think I'm probably its biggest supporter at this point.
Yeah, we flip-flopped opinions on that one pretty hard, but although I do like the Mom Quintorius. This one's just kind of like, I don't think we're not even really considering it, but 5 mana, 4 loyalty walker that pluses to make a 3/2 every turn is like not bad. Obviously, that's not Vivian, right? Which Vivian makes much better tokens, but plus to make a 3/2, plus to make a 3/2, that's pretty good in my estimation. And I think my suspicion is that the static ability like triggers more often than you think it would, just because of how red cards are designed these days, where everything casts from exile.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're getting good value out of that, that's where I could see it being worthwhile and being potentially better than Quintorius Lore Master in some spots. But I think you've really got to be leveraging that drain. The one nice thing, I guess, is when you use the Discover effect, you do get a free drain if you choose to cast the card from exile.
I mean, just to emphasize Chris's point from earlier, it's really touchy to have that Discover on a Planeswalker, where you're just fingers crossed, hoping I hit something that protects my Planeswalker. Like, you have no guarantee that the Planeswalker is even going to hit anything, and then your opponent just attacks it down and kills it. That's kind of rough.
Yeah, I'm not big on this card, but I see the drain effect being something that is probably, if this card sees play, I feel like it's going to be off that, and it's probably going to be doing something degenerate, if I'm being honest. I feel like that's kind of the play there, right? Is find something really silly to do where we storm our opponent off or something.
I'm sure there's like busted stuff you can do with it in Commander because it don't
for
your
sure.
opponent.
Yeah, I've started calling these paradox effects. The Doctor Who deck had a mechanic called Paradox, which was something that triggered when you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, and they've been printing a lot of these lately, right. Like the Prosper Tomebound Lich effect and stuff like that. We do have some lands to talk about. Just take a moment of appreciation that Cavern of Souls is in this set for some reason and is in the card pool now. Obviously, we don't care about that, but just like, haha, take that blue. Take that counter spells.
Why? Why did we need this card in the card pool?
Not
blue
sure.
is the worst color in the historic card pool. And it's just like, come on, man.
Yeah. We got the other half of the cycle of creature lands from Wilds of Eldraine, which I had a suspicion we were going to get those. It seems weird to only do a half cycle. Don't need to read all of these, but do you guys have any that you want to pick out as like one that really sparks your interest or might be cubable here? They're all kind of like flat power level across the board.
I think the blue-white one's really good. I think making game objects that scale its stats up is pretty nice. Like, I don't necessarily think it's replacing Colonnade in formats that have that, but if you don't have access to Celestial Colonnade because of card pool restrictions, this is probably going to work. And I also think it's got some value that Colonnade doesn't have, in that it actually generates game objects. That being said, the way manlands typically play out for the decks that want them is that you trade resources back and forth with your opponent, and then your manlands give you an edge because you have it sitting in your mana base. So this generating game objects is less relevant when Colonnade would just kill them.
Yeah, Chris, do you have any in the bunch here that you think might be worth cubing with, or ones that you find interesting in general?
I think if I was interested in any of them, it would be the blue-black and the blue-white one, just because, like, they're ham sandwiches that you can just put in your mana base. It's just another way for a control deck to sneak a slow win condition into their deck without actually having to play another win condition card. To be honest with you, like, creature lands don't overly excite me for whatever reason, but that doesn't mean that they're not good. I just noticed that the blue-black one has Death Touch for some reason, even though it's a 4/4. I guess that could be relevant.
Yeah, Death Touch is a little strange. We were talking about this one off air, but the blue-black one is a weird design specifically for blue-black, but it also has mill text on it, which I'm kind of overlooking, like that's not relevant, but that is probably very relevant for like constructed and limited when you're caring about your graveyard. But for us, the mill text doesn't matter too much, and the death touch is a little strange. But I'm not super inspired by this cycle compared to the last one. I do like the art on the blue one, and I think it's good, but the blue-white decks might not use map. I don't know. It's weird to have a creature land that then spits out something that you're supposed to spend more mana on, because they're already so mana intensive, which is why we don't just jam all of these into the queue. But they're fine. They're all kind of like mid power level. Not really knocking at the door of like must plays or anything like that. But I think I agree. I like the blue ones here the most.
The blue-white ones also like kind of compensates for that by being a little cheaper to cast. It's only 3 mana to animate it, so 4 altogether to attack with it, as opposed to 5 or 6 like most of these creature lands are.
Yeah, the blue ones also have really good art. I don't know about this llama one. That one's kind of like
That one felt very much memey.
What were the farmers doing? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, that's all of the cards here. I personally don't have super strong opinions about this set like I did with Wilds of Eldraine. What I will say, just to kind of wrap up my thoughts here, is I think the execution of Descend and Descended is really messy, which I know Teld is going to counter against, but I don't think it's a good idea for new players to use the same word, like the same root word, in multiple ways. And I can imagine somebody playing their first pre-release who doesn't quite grasp that Descend 4, Descend 8, Fathomless Descent are not the same thing as Descended, like in terms of actual game action. So I'm not a huge fan of that. Though I do like map tokens, obviously these little trinkety tchotchke things I'm a huge fan of. They always play out better than you think and have more application than you think. And personally, I think craft is a really cool mechanic that they kind of like jump the shark with immediately instead of like easing into it. It would have been really nice if all of the craft cards were just craft with artifact and it was consistent, but you've got ones that read like really weird because of the way the ability works. Like one of them is like craft with merfolk and dinosaur and pirate and human and whatever, and it's like, did we need to jump into this from the beginning with a new mechanic? I don't think so, but we didn't talk about craft at all here because it is kind of like an artifact centric thing that doesn't really translate to non-thematic cubes. So that's just kind of my opinion of the mechanics, the flavor of the set, spelunking and stuff like that. Sure, I could take it or leave it. I was never a huge fan of like the factions, like the pirates and dinosaurs and stuff like that in original Ixalan, and they're taking a back seat in this set anyway, so not super jazzed about that. So there's not a lot that like strikes my fancy, but there are a lot of cool individual cards, though I'm not a huge fan of like just the numbers being pushed on a lot of things here. Like a lot of these cards are just stats, like plus abilities, which I don't know. This is kind of in the middle for me, so curious where you guys land on this set after talking about these individual cards.
I do think the Descend and Descended was handled really well, personally. I think that it makes a lot of sense that if you've descended, you know, you've put a permanent in the graveyard, so we're getting deeper into the caverns, and then as we get there, we've got our markers of 4 and 8, where we're getting deeper and deeper into the cavern, and Fathomless Descent is like we fell down the hole, and now there's no telling where it's going to end. So I thought it all made sense and was very tied together. I kind of push back that it's going to be confusing. I tend to think of it as the opposite of I thought it was very easy to like place them in my head that we've descended. So we've got various levels of descent that we've descended to. Maybe that's something that a new player's going to be confusing. I'm skeptical that it's going to be confusing, but we'll see. I think thematically, like the flavor of this set and some of the mechanics were super cool. I really liked how this felt like a set that did, it feels like the set's very mechanical or very flavorfully tied together. So this set, unlike Woe, where we talked about, it didn't feel like Eldraine. It didn't feel like the sort of Arthurian fairy tales that we were. It didn't feel like any of that, right? And this set does. It feels very much like it's the original Ixalan, this kind of Mesoamerican theme that's been, you know, we're kind of mixing it with the journey to the center of the earth sort of thematic. Kind of wrapping that up, I think I really loved the Resplendent Angel reprint. I think it's a cool way to do art where it showcases it in the new context, new set, without feeling like it's just trying to replace the old one, because I feel like they both display very, very different things in a very elegant way. So I think the Resplendent Angel reprint art was super cool in this set. Anyways, maps are also really nice. Really like them. I wasn't huge on this set going into it, but I actually think the set looks like it's going to be very cool. I hope it plays out pretty well and is just a beatdown format, but every format's a beatdown format these days, so we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see how the limited format pans out. Chris, what are your takes here on Lost Caverns of Ixalan?
I second Teld's point that I think they did a really good job of respecting the Mesoamerican themes that they were drawing on in a way that felt more evocative and a little bit more intentional than the original Ixalan. So I like that about it, and I am also happy to see map tokens. You could theoretically imagine some alternate plane or set where like maps and explore is something that they can revisit. You know, they've been introducing a lot of these new artifact tokens that like do something for 1 or 2 mana, and I do appreciate the creation of those game objects. For paper cubers, I'm sure it's going to be annoying to have to get even more tokens than you already have to maintain. For us, obviously not an issue. One thing that I will say is that there are a lot of really powerful cards in this set. It's like they knew that the original Ixalan was an extremely low power set, and they made like a deliberate choice to go in the complete opposite direction in this set. Although I will say that a lot of the really powerful playable cards in the set are just kind of like stat sticks. They're just giant honkin' things that take over games without doing anything particularly like synergistic or like evocative. So I'm not crazy about that. My final thought on the set is, holy shit, what a haul for blue tempo. Like, what an insane haul for blue tempo. It's cool to see them pushing blue tempo effects and creatures like this. I'm really excited to see that. I do hope that they don't just push blue in like every set going forward into being a more creature-centric color. I would have liked to see like a pushed blue effect that I'm interested in for my control decks. But yeah, our blue flash counterspell creature deck got some like really nice toys from this set.
Yeah, blue was the biggest winner from the set for sure. Whereas some of the other colors have a lot to talk about, but not actually stuff that we're getting from the cube. So yeah, I mean, that's Caverns of Ixalan. We'll see how it plays out in Limited. I think in the near future, we're planning on doing a look back at a couple cluster of sets and talk about like what from our reviews did we get right, what did we miss out on. There's always a card or two that, you know, makes itself very obvious after we do the set review that we should have talked about it and maybe should be playing it. So we don't have a cadence for how those sorts of episodes are gonna slot in, but we do want to look back at sets in certain intervals and talk about, you know, what we missed, what went right, what did we nail, you know. Any final closing thoughts here on ye old LCI?
No, I mean, I'm a little worried that this set's going to be another Princey kind of set because, like you guys have mentioned, the stat sticks of beaters, they just have like no investment cost. I think it's going to be one of those situations where you're playing this kind of grindy game where you're trying to set up Descend and you're trying to set up Craft and you're trying to do all these cool synergistic things. Your opponent's going to resolve a Carnosaur and it's like, oh, the game's over, huh?
Yeah, we'll get a feel for that in early access.
Yeah, and then I'm also like, I don't know about how the longevity of this set's going to work because we are next month getting a remaster or a reprint, I guess is more accurate because I don't think they're actually changing anything, of Khans of Tarkir, which if you haven't played that set is often regarded by older players, myself and Tim included, as one of the best sets ever made. And so it's kind of like, this set's going to have to be really good to make me want to not play Khans.
Yeah, that's true. Khans rubbing right up against it. But we do get a solid month or so before Khans comes out, so it'll have its day in the sun, or rather not. I guess it's in a cavern. Whatever the euphemism is. Let's go ahead and close this bad boy out. So thanks to everybody listening. As always, remember the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback. Great place to hang out with like-minded individuals, talk about Cube, Retail Limited, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, whatever you're doing with those cards, all things Magic. We draft our more powerful and restricted cubes on Sundays at 7:30 Eastern, Peasant Cube, and Specialty Cubes alternating on Wednesdays at 7:30 Eastern. And you can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. Check out our socials, Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming. You can find Teld streaming and possibly streaming Lost Caverns of Ixalan early access at twitch.tv/teldtalks, TELD Talks. And remember, you can find this podcast on Spotify as well. That's going to go ahead and do it for a set review. A lot of cards out of the way. Excited to actually get these in action. And we'll report back on how they perform. But thanks for listening. We'll catch you all next time.
See you guys.
You sign off this time, or are we good?
So, yeah, quick sign off because this is a set review. I wanted to talk real briefly about how I got my favorite playmat, which is a Ixalan themed playmat. Very cool map of Ixalan with like Orazca, the Golden City. It has all these different locations that you can recognize from the cards, like its content and stuff like that. And it's a good showcase of like why you don't give up in a match of Magic. You don't concede until the last thing happens. But just to set the stage, we're playing at a store championship. The first place prize is the playmat, so obviously I end up winning the championship, so you can see where this story's going. I am in the winning in match for top 8, so the structure was play sealed, Ixalan sealed, cut to top 8, and then winner gets the playmat. And we're playing the winning in match for top 8, so if I lose, I'm out of top 8, I'm going home. If I win, I'm in top 8, I get to keep playing. And I'm playing against a new guy by the name of Derek. Chris might remember him. He was a very new, friendly guy, really trying to learn Magic, but he was prone to mistakes. Let's just put it that way. So here's how the match goes. We're in game 3. My life total is 6. I'm Hellbent. My opponent has a creature on board. I believe the name of the card is Storm Sculptor. It is a 3/2 unblockable with other text that doesn't matter. I'm at 6 life. My opponent is also Hellbent. So I have nothing on board except lands. My opponent has a 3/2 unblockable, and I'm at 6 life. It's their turn. They hit me for 3. I go down to 3. And I can't do anything about it. Like, it's one of those games where I've just on the back foot. We had to trade off resources, and I've just got nothing going on. So it's like do or die time. My opponent's got a 3/2 unblockable on board. I have 3 life, and I need to top deck, like, Heart of the Cards, Yu-Gi-Oh! Top deck my way out of this. And I go to my turn, I draw for turn, and the card I draw is Crushing Canopy, which is an instant that destroys a flyer, an artifact, or an enchantment. And my opponent has none of those things on board. So I'm dead. Like, I'm just dead on board. My opponent just has to attack me. I pass the turn to Derek. Derek draws his card for turn, his only card in hand. And he starts tanking. And I don't know if you guys know me that well or not, but like when I'm dead on board and all my opponent has to do to attack, like I'm just like, kill me, kill me so I can go on with my life. I'm like seething here because he is just prolonging this attack. All he has to do is turn his 3/2 unblockable sideways and kill me, and I am dead. And he's like sitting there thumbing his card, flicking it around like, what do I do? What do I do? And I'm just like, come on, man. But by some like huge turn of luck, he decides that he wants to make sure I die this turn, and he puts 1 with the Wind on his Storm Sculptor, and 1 with the Wind is an enchantment that gives +2/+2 in flying. So suddenly my Crushing Canopy can kill his 3/2 unblockable. So I Crushing Canopy, kill his Merfolk, and he just instantly, like, hands and face, like, I can't believe that happened. My next turn, I top deck Gashath. I attack him with Gashath, and I get to free roll as a Talpa into play, and the game just ends in 2 turns. And it's like one of those moments where I just felt terrible because Derek like had the win on board. We're playing for top 8. He's a new player, so top 8 would have been huge for him. But he just made this mistake of like going all in on this creature that was already lethal, and it felt terrible to win that game because I should not have won that game. But
does that explain your love of Zetalpa the Primal Dawn?
I hate Zetalpa. I absolutely hate Zetalpa. No, my top decks aren't even like the crucial part of that story. The fact that I just drew a blank and my opponent gave me a way to turn that blank into a removal spell against a creature that was lethal without anything else happening on board, just like huge stroke of luck. But yeah, that playmat reminds me of it every time I pull it out. It's a really cool playmat, and I hope, Derek, if you're listening.
Tim, subscriber of the Reduke School of Magic, as we see. Never give up, never surrender, make them kill you.
I'm not like that at all anymore. I'll concede in a heartbeat if I think I'm losing. I'm like, my time is more valuable at this stage in my life. I'm at 19, right-click concede, I'm done.
But wait, there's more!
I love the boat.
Yu-Gi-Oh!
Hell yeah.
Everything has Flash now.
Being a Magic player, I can't read.
Bat God.
Everything's good with Luris.